I still feel the chill when I think about that place, that little art gallery tucked away in the forgotten corner of the old town. It's been years now, but the memory sticks to my mind like a fresh coat of paint, vivid, inescapable. I was 26, freshly graduated from my art history program and probably a little too full of myself. I'd snagged a temporary curator assistant position at the Oakhaven Municipal Gallery. It wasn't the Met, not by a long shot. More like a dusty collection of local landscapes and antique curiosities, housed in a converted 19th century mansion, far from any major city bustle. Oakhaven itself was one of those sleepy, isolated towns where everyone knew everyone, and the most exciting thing to happen in a decade was the new traffic light on Main Street. The gallery, perched on a slight rise at the edge of town, felt even more removed. My daily routine was pretty mundane. Unlock the heavy oak doors, disarm the ancient alarm system that often gave false positives, and then wander through the silent halls, flicking on lights, checking humidity levels, and making sure no one had somehow smuggled a particularly garish ceramic cat onto a pedestal overnight. I was usually alone for the first couple of hours each morning, a quiet solitude I initially cherished. It was just me, the echoing footsteps on the polished wood floors, and the watchful eyes of countless painted figures. I'd tell myself it was good for my focus, for really immersing myself in the art. Now, looking back, I realize how much that isolation played into everything that happened. I was young, ambitious, and maybe a little too eager to prove I could handle things on my own. It felt like an adventure, not a precursor to absolute dread. Most days, the biggest challenge was dealing with Mrs. Gable, the gallery director, who had a penchant for rearranging the gift shop display right after I'd meticulously organized it. My typical afternoon involved cataloging new donations, mostly dusty old portraits of Oakhaven's founding families, none of them particularly exciting. My favorite part of the day was the late afternoon, just before closing. The light would slant through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, casting long, dramatic shadows. It was peaceful, almost meditative. Then came the new acquisition. A large, rather grim portrait of a man from the late 1700s, donated by a distant relative of one of Oakhaven's original landowners. It arrived in a hefty crate, and Mrs. Gable, always keen on displaying local heritage, decided it should hang in the main hall right by the grand staircase where the natural light was best. I remember thinking it was an odd choice. The painting was dark, depicting a stern-faced gentleman in a powdered wig, his eyes a murky brown, his expression unreadable. He looked like he'd just swallowed a lemon and was trying to hide it. The canvas was old, cracked in places, and the colors muted by time, but there was a certain quality to the brushwork, a subtle realism that made him seem almost alive. I spent an hour that Tuesday afternoon, after the last visitors had left and Mrs. Gable had retired to her office, carefully uncrating the portrait and supervising its hanging. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked, and took two of us to lift. Once it was up, centered perfectly on the wall, I stepped back to admire our work. The subject's eyes seemed to follow me, a trick of the light and the artist's skill, I told myself. It was just a painting. A very old, very stern painting. I did my usual rounds, locked up, and went home, forgetting all about the lemon-faced gentleman until the next morning. The next day, as the first shafts of morning light pierced the gallery windows, and I made my way to the main hall for the daily checks, I paused. I remember the exact moment. The grand staircase loomed to my right, the tall windows to my left, and there on the wall was the new portrait. The light was still dim, the gallery barely awake, but something about the painting was different. The man's face, etched in sepia and shadow, seemed softer. Not happy, not sad, just less rigid. His lips, which had been a thin, severe line the day before, appeared slightly less compressed. The deep furrows around his mouth seemed to have lessened, almost imperceptibly. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. It had to be the light or my imagination playing tricks in the early morning quiet, a product of staring at too many portraits. I dismissed it, unlocked Mrs. Gable's office, and started my day. But the seed of something unsettling had been planted, a tiny, cold prickle at the back of my neck. That prickle, though dismissed, didn't quite fade. It lingered, a tiny, annoying static charge under my skin. The next day I approached the main hall with a new, almost imperceptible caution. I told myself it was just curiosity, a professional interest in how the light played on the old canvas, but deep down I was checking, and sure enough, the man's face seemed to have shifted again. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, nothing that would make a casual observer gasp. It was subtle, insidious. The slight softening I'd noticed yesterday had deepened, evolving into something akin to a faint smirk. His eyes, those murky brown pools, seemed to hold a flicker of amusement, an almost imperceptible glint that hadn't been there before. I stood there for a long time, my heart thumping a little faster than usual. I walked around the painting, examining it from different angles, checking the lighting, even running a hand lightly over the cool, slightly damp wall nearby, as if a change in humidity could alter painted expressions. Nothing. The gallery was quiet, save for the distant hum of the ventilation system. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was absurd. Paintings didn't change. Not like this, not without an artist's brush or the passage of centuries of natural degradation, and even then, not in a matter of hours. I spent the better part of that morning trying to rationalize it. My eyes must be playing tricks on me. The stress of a new job, the isolation, maybe I was overtired. I even wondered if someone was playing a prank. But who? Mrs. Gable was meticulous to a fault, and her pranks usually involved hiding my favorite teacup. Besides, how would one subtly alter an oil portrait without leaving a trace? It was impossible. Yet the image of that faint smirk kept returning to my mind throughout the day. I found myself making excuses to walk through the main hall, always glancing at the portrait, always half expecting, half dreading another change. By the time I locked up that evening, the man's expression seemed to have settled back into something more neutral, though still far less severe than when it had first arrived. It was unsettling, like a secret shared only with me. The pattern continued. Each morning, without fail, I would find a subtle alteration in the portrait. Sometimes it was the eyes, a widening, a narrowing, a subtle shift in focus. Other times, the mouth, that smirk, a slight frown, a hint of something melancholic. The most unnerving changes were the most minute, a slight tilt of the head, an almost imperceptible narrowing of the shoulders, as if the figure was settling into itself. It was never a drastic overhaul, nothing I could definitively point to and say, look, it's different. It was a cumulative effect, a slow, creeping transformation that gnawed at my perception of reality. I started taking pictures with my phone discreetly each morning before the gallery opened. I'd line up the shot as precisely as possible, trying to capture the exact angle and lighting. Then in the privacy of my small rented apartment, I would compare them. My initial comparisons were frustrating. The differences were so slight, so much a product of light and shadow that I couldn't always be sure. But as the days turned into a week, then two, the evidence began to mount. A specific wrinkle near his left eye, barely visible in the first picture, was undeniably softer in the later ones. The line of his jaw seemed less angular. The hint of a dimple I hadn't noticed before seemed to appear, then vanish. I zoomed in, pixel by pixel, my heart hammering. I wasn't going crazy. It was changing. My routine, once so mundane, became a ritual of apprehension. Unlocking the gallery doors, disarming the alarm, walking the silent halls, it was all a prelude to the moment I would confront the portrait. My stomach would tighten, a cold dread coiling in my gut. I started arriving earlier, trying to catch it in the act, as if the painted man moved when no one was looking. but it was always still, always just waiting for me. The changes weren't always linear. One morning, the faint smirk would be back, the next, a profound sadness, then a look of almost smug contentment. It was like watching a slow-motion unraveling of a personality, a reflection of moods I couldn't possibly fathom. I began to feel a strange connection to the portrait, an unwilling intimacy. It was as if it was communicating with me or perhaps reacting to me. I'd stand before it, my reflection a distorted ghost in the old glass protecting the canvas, and try to decipher its new emotion. What did he want? What was he trying to say? I debated telling Mrs. Gable. The thought made my palms sweat. Mrs. Gable was a creature of strict order and empirical evidence. She'd dismiss it as overwork, stress, or a silly flight of fancy. She'd probably suggest I take a few days off, which I couldn't afford to do. More importantly, she'd look at me like I was delusional, and I wasn't entirely sure she'd be wrong. Part of me clung desperately to the idea that there was a logical explanation, however bizarre, that I just hadn't found yet. I dove into research. I spent hours in the gallery's small, dusty archives, poring over art restoration journals and obscure texts on peculiar art phenomena. I read about pigment degradation, the effects of humidity and temperature on canvas, optical illusions, even psychological biases in perception. I found nothing that explained a portrait subtly altering its expression and features daily. The closest I came were tales of haunted paintings, but I scoffed at such superstitions. I was an art historian, a woman of science and fact, not folklore. One afternoon, I was meticulously cataloging some new donations, a collection of antique butter churns and a faded quilt, when I overheard Mrs. Gable on the phone. Her voice, usually crisp and efficient, was laced with a hint of concern. "Yes, Mr. Davies, it arrived safely. It's hanging in the main hall now. We appreciate the donation, of course. A significant piece of local history. What was that? A reputation." My pen paused mid-stroke. Mr. Davies was the distant relative who had donated the portrait. "Oh, I see," Mrs. Gable continued, her tone shifting to one of polite dismissal. "Well, I assure you it's quite secure here. We have excellent climate control. No, I haven't noticed anything of the sort, just a very old painting. Thank you for the warning, though. Goodbye." She hung up with a decisive click, then sighed, a rare display of exasperation. I pretended to be engrossed in the butter churns, my ears straining. Had Mr. Davies mentioned something about the painting's reputation? What kind of reputation? Later that day, emboldened by my growing unease and the need for some kind of external validation, I asked Mrs. Gable about the portrait. I tried to keep my voice casual, professional. "Mrs. Gable," I began, sorting through some exhibition pamphlets, "that new portrait, the Mr. Blackwood one, do we have any more information on it? Any background on the artist, perhaps? It's quite striking." Mrs. Gable looked up from her ledger, pushing her reading glasses up her nose. "Ah, Mr. Blackwood, yes, a fascinating piece. The donor, Mr. Davies, was rather vague about the artist. Said it was a local talent, a journeyman painter from the late 1700s, but no name survived. A common occurrence for the period, unfortunately." She paused, her gaze drifting towards the main hall. "Mr. Davies did mention a rather peculiar family anecdote, if you can call it that." My breath hitched. Oh, what was that? She pursed her lips. "He claimed the painting had a history of being unsettling, that it watched people. Nonsense, of course, old family superstitions. He seemed rather eager to offload it, if I'm being honest. said it had been gathering dust in their ancestral home for generations in an attic for the most part. They only rediscovered it during a clear-out. Unsettling how, I pressed, trying to sound genuinely curious, not personally terrified. He was rather vague, just that people who lived with it found it unnerving, felt observed. Some claimed the eyes followed them. A simple optical trick, as you know, dear, very common in portraiture. She gave a dismissive wave of her hand. Honestly, some people and their fanciful notions. It's a painting, Clara. A very old, very still painting. I nodded, pretending to accept her explanation, but a cold wave washed over me. The eyes follow you. It was the first thing I'd noticed, the initial spark of unease. And it wasn't just the eyes anymore. It was the entire face, the whole demeanor. That night I couldn't sleep. The words unsettling, watched, reputation echoed in my mind. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, picturing the man in the portrait, his shifting expressions, his silent observation. I felt an irrational fear, a primitive dread I hadn't experienced since I was a child, convinced there was a monster under my bed. The next morning, I braced myself. I practically ran to the main hall, my heart pounding. What new horror would greet me? What fresh torment would the painted man inflict upon my perception? He was smiling, not a faint smirk this time, but a distinct, unsettlingly wide smile. His thin lips were stretched, revealing a hint of teeth, and his eyes, rather than being merely amused or melancholic, sparkled with a malicious glee. It was an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph, a mocking, knowing grin that sent a shiver straight through me, deeper than any I'd felt before. I stumbled back, gasping, my hand flying to my mouth. This wasn't subtle anymore. This was undeniable. This was aggressive. The change was so stark, so blatant, that it felt like a punch to the gut. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling to take another photo. But as I raised it, a strange sense of exhaustion washed over me. My eyelids felt heavy, my limbs leaden. A peculiar sweet scent, like old potpourri and something metallic, suddenly filled the air around the painting, cloying and disorienting. Clara, are you all right, dear? You look a little pale. Mrs. Gable's voice, sharp and brisk, cut through the strange haze. She was standing at the entrance to the main hall, holding a stack of mail, her brow furrowed in concern. I jumped, startled, dropping my phone with a clatter. Mrs. Gable, good morning. Yes, I'm fine, just feeling a bit lightheaded. I bent to pick up my phone, my eyes darting back to the portrait. The smile was gone. The man's face had reverted to the stern, unreadable expression it had possessed the day it arrived. The deep furrows were back, the lips a thin, severe line. He looked exactly as he had originally, perhaps even more grim, as if annoyed by the interruption. The cloying scent was gone too, replaced by the usual faint smell of old paper and dust. I stared, utterly bewildered. My mind reeled. Had I imagined it? Had the strange scent, the sudden exhaustion, been some kind of hallucination? My rational brain screamed yes, but the vividness of that triumphant, malicious smile was seared into my memory. Lightheaded, you say? Mrs. Gable eyed me suspiciously. Perhaps you're coming down with something. We can't have you fainting on the job. The fall exhibition is only a month away, and we have mountains of work to do. No, I'm perfectly fine, I insisted, forcing a smile that felt utterly fake. Just a momentary dizzy spell. I'll get some coffee. I hurried away, leaving Mrs. Gable to scrutinize the mail and presumably the perfectly unsmiling Mr. Blackwood. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the coffee pot. My mind was a maelstrom of fear and confusion. It had changed, I knew it had, but why did it revert when Mrs. Gable arrived? Was it aware? Was it performing for me? The idea was so preposterous, so utterly insane, that it sent a fresh wave of panic through me. From that day on, my sleep became fitful. The painted man invaded my dreams, his expressions morphing, his eyes following me through dimly lit corridors. I woke up in cold sweats, convinced I could still smell that strange, sweet, metallic odor. The lines between reality and nightmare began to blur. I started to develop a routine to try and document the changes more effectively, a desperate attempt to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I bought a small, high-definition camera, pretending it was for my art history blog. I set it up on a tripod each morning, pointed at the painting, just before Mrs. Gable arrived. I set it to record time-lapse footage, hoping to capture the subtle shifts. For several mornings, I recorded nothing. The painting remained stubbornly still, grim-faced, refusing to reveal its secrets to the mechanical eye. I began to doubt myself again, to wonder if I was truly just exhausted, projecting my fears onto an inanimate object. But then, on the fifth morning of recording, something happened. I reviewed the footage that evening, my heart in my throat. The early frames showed the typical stern expression. Then, about 10 minutes before I would typically arrive, a faint shimmering like heat haze seemed to emanate from the canvas. The colors deepened slightly, the lines sharpened, and then subtly, undeniably, the face began to change. The lips softened, the eyes widened just a fraction, a hint of curiosity replacing the severity. It was slow, almost imperceptible, yet clearly visible in the time lapse. It wasn't a smile this time, but a look of intense contemplation, almost yearning. The changes would hold for a few minutes, then slowly, like a film played in reverse, the face would regress to its original grimness, the shimmer fading. It was never quite as dramatic as the triumphant smile I'd witnessed firsthand, but it was enough. Proof. I watched the footage again and again, my hands clammy. It moved, it truly moved, and it only seemed to move when it was entirely alone. The reputation Mr. Davies mentioned clicked into place. This wasn't just an optical illusion, this was something active, something alive. The knowledge was terrifying, exhilarating. I had proof. But what did it mean? I remembered a lecture from my art history days about animism, the belief that inanimate objects possess a spiritual essence. It had been presented as a historical curiosity, a primitive worldview. Now it felt unsettlingly real. My next step, I decided, was to research the man in the portrait, Mr. Blackwood. If the painting was alive, perhaps the man himself held clues. I went back to the archives, this time focusing on Oak Haven's local history. Mr. Blackwood, I discovered, was a prominent landowner in the late 1700s, a successful merchant who had amassed considerable wealth. The archives painted him as a shrewd, often ruthless businessman, known for his relentless pursuit of profit. There were whispers in old town records, buried in property disputes and local court documents, of questionable dealings, of land acquired through dubious means, of broken promises to native tribes, and even a few vague references to employees who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Nothing concrete, nothing that would warrant a criminal investigation by today's standards, but enough to paint a picture of a man not universally beloved. His wife, a Martha Blackwood, was mentioned briefly as a quiet, reclusive woman who died young, reportedly of a wasting sickness. Their only child, a son, died in infancy. Mr. Blackwood himself died quite suddenly, barely 50 years old, leaving his substantial estate to a distant nephew. The cause of death was listed as apoplexy, a common term for stroke in that era, but there was an unusual footnote in the town doctor's ledger, a mention of unaccountable terror witnessed by his servants in his final moments. Unaccountable terror. The phrase resonated with me, a cold echo of my own growing fear. Had Mr. Blackwood been haunted by something or someone in his final days? Was this painting a manifestation of his spirit, trapped and restless, or something else entirely? I started spending my lunch breaks in the small, rarely used library at the back of the gallery, hidden behind rows of dusty exhibition catalogs. I devoured old Oakhaven town histories, genealogical records, and even local legends. The name Blackwood kept popping up, almost always in relation to land disputes or peculiar incidents. One old newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile, detailed a fire that had mysteriously destroyed a competing merchant's warehouse just before Blackwood secured a lucrative shipping contract. The official cause was accidental, but the language hinted at lingering suspicions. As I delved deeper, a recurring motif emerged. Whispers of a hidden treasure, not gold or jewels, but something more esoteric. Rumors spoke of Blackwood possessing an unusual collection of artifacts, some said to be linked to local indigenous folklore, others described as strange carvings or unusual stones. He was known to be a collector of the macabre, a man with an insatiable curiosity for the occult, a trait rarely mentioned in polite society. These details were never formally documented, only hinted at in diaries or personal letters from the era, dismissed as idle gossip. But in the context of a moving portrait, they suddenly took on a sinister significance. The archive's atmosphere, once merely dusty, now felt charged with suppressed secrets. I felt like I was prying into something I shouldn't, disturbing a long-dead past. The isolation of the gallery, which I once cherished, now felt like a cage. My solitude was no longer peaceful. It was a constant, gnawing awareness that I was alone with it. One afternoon, a delivery truck arrived, carrying a rather large and ungainly sculpture, a bronze rendering of a local mayor from the 1920s. Mrs. Gable was in a flurry, directing the two burly delivery men with her usual precise instructions. I helped guide the hand truck through the gallery, past the main hall. As we rounded the corner, one of the delivery men, a burly fellow with a thick mustache, paused, his gaze fixed on the Blackwood portrait. "Whoa," he mumbled, his voice rough. "That fella looks like he's about to jump right off the canvas." My heart leaped. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He scratched his head, just the way his eyes are, almost like he's watching us. "Gives me the creeps, that one." He chuckled, a nervous sound. "Seen a lot of paintings, but never one quite so lifelike." He shrugged and moved on, but his casual observation was a small victory for me. Someone else had noticed something, even if it was just the eyes following you effect. It wasn't just my imagination. It was the first external validation I'd had since the process began, but it also proved that the painting could reveal itself to others, if only subtly. Why did it choose to be so dramatically active only for me? The next day, the portrait greeted me with an unnerving intensity. The usual subtle shifts were gone. Instead, the eyes were wide, almost pleading, and the lips were parted just slightly, as if the painted man was about to speak. It was a look of profound desperation, a silent scream frozen in oil. A new, more potent wave of that sweet, metallic odor filled the main hall, making my head spin. I stumbled, clutching at a nearby display case, feeling the familiar onset of dizziness and nausea. I remembered the time-lapse camera. I had set it up earlier than usual, hoping to catch more of the pre-opening activity. I rushed to it, my hands fumbling, checking the indicator light. It was on. It was recording. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. The desperation in his eyes, the almost palpable plea, was overwhelming. What was he desperate for? What did he want? I felt a sudden, irrational urge to help him, to somehow release him from his painted prison. It was a dangerous thought, I knew, but the intensity of the expression was hypnotic. I spent the next few hours in a daze, performing my duties mechanically. Mrs. Gable, oblivious, bustled about, preparing for a school group visit. I kept glancing at the portrait, which of course had reverted to its stern, impenetrable state. The desperation was gone, replaced by the familiar impassiveness. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew the camera had captured it. That evening, I uploaded the footage to my laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I fast-forwarded through the early morning hours, past my arrival, past Mrs. Gable's first appearance. And there it was, not just a change in expression, but something far more disturbing. The first subtle shifts began around 6:30 a.m., about an hour before I arrived. The light in the gallery was still dim, but the camera, with its low-light capabilities, picked it up clearly. The man's face softened, then stretched, settling into that look of pleading desperation. His eyes, fixed on the empty space directly in front of the painting, seemed to search for something. And then it started. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the canvas. The colors on his face seemed to ripple like water, and from the corner of his right eye, a single, glistening tear began to form, tracing a slow, agonizing path down his painted cheek. It was a perfectly rendered tear, shimmering in the artificial light, a drop of pure liquid despair. I gasped, pressing my hand to my mouth. A painted tear. It wasn't possible. It defied every law of physics, every artistic principle I knew. My rational mind screamed for an explanation, but there was none. The tear remained for several minutes, slowly drying, leaving a faint, almost invisible streak on the canvas. As it faded, the face slowly returned to its original, impassive state just before I entered the frame. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. This wasn't just a portrait that changed expressions. This was something altogether more profound, more horrifying. This was a painting that could weep. The implications were staggering. If it could shed a tear, what else could it do? Could it speak? Could it move more freely? Was it suffering, or was it manipulating me? I rewound the footage, watching the tear form and fade again and again. Each time, a fresh wave of dread washed over me. The sweet, metallic smell, the dizziness, it wasn't just my imagination. It was a physical manifestation, a byproduct of the painting's activity. I spent the entire night watching the footage, analyzing every second. The man's desperate expression, the single tear, it felt like a direct plea for help, a silent cry from a trapped soul. But I also remembered the malevolent grin, the triumphant smirk. Which was the real Mr. Blackwood, the victim or the tormentor, or perhaps both? My research into Mr. Blackwood had painted him as a ruthless man, but also a figure steeped in strange collections and hidden folklore. Could the painting be a vessel for his spirit, or perhaps something that imprisoned his spirit? The stories of native artifacts and occult objects now haunted me. What if the painting wasn't just a painting, but some kind of cursed object, a focus for an ancient evil? The thought was chilling. If it was cursed, and I was the only one truly witnessing its phenomena, was I becoming entangled in its curse? Was I its next victim? I thought of the other missing people in Blackwood's past, the unaccountable terror he experienced before his death. Was this painting somehow linked to his demise? Was it feeding on the gallery's quiet solitude, on my own naive ambition, using my isolation to manifest more clearly? I decided I couldn't keep this to myself anymore, at least not entirely. I needed help, but I couldn't go to Mrs. Gable. She would never believe me, especially not with recorded footage that looked like something out of a horror movie. I needed someone who might understand, someone who dealt with the inexplicable. My mind immediately went to Professor Alastair Finch, my former art history mentor from university. He was eccentric, open-minded, and had a known fascination with art's more unusual histories, even dabbling in occult art theory, much to the chagrin of his more traditional colleagues. He was known for his vast personal library, a treasure trove of forgotten lore and esoteric knowledge. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it would be Professor Finch. I pulled out my old university address book, my hands still trembling slightly. I found his number, an old landline that he rarely changed. It was late, but I couldn't wait. I needed to talk to him to get his advice to break the crushing solitude of my burden. I needed a tether to sanity. My finger hovered over the dial pad. I had to be careful. I couldn't sound unhinged. I had to present the facts calmly, rationally, even the ones that defied logic. I needed to convince him, not scare him away. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. This was no longer just about a job. It was about something far more profound, something that had crept from the dusty corners of history into my life, threatening to unravel everything I thought I knew about the world. I was on the precipice of something terrifying and magnificent, and I was utterly alone in facing it. I dialed, the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring was like a hammer blow against my tense nerves. Would he answer? Would he believe me? Just as I was about to give up, a sleepy, gravelly voice answered. "Finch here. Who on earth is calling at this hour?" "Professor Finch, it's Clara Davies, Clara Hayes from Oakhaven. I'm so sorry to call so late, but I need your help. It's about a painting." There was a long pause, then a sigh. "Clara, my dear girl, it must be important if you're interrupting my slumber. A painting, you say? What sort of painting could possibly warrant such an urgent summons?" His tone was bemused, but also held a hint of the curiosity I knew he possessed. It's changing, Professor, and I have proof." Another silence, longer this time. "Changing, you say, not merely light or degradation then?" His voice was suddenly sharper, more alert. The sleepiness was gone. "Tell me everything, Clara, from the very beginning." And so I did. I recounted the entire saga, from the initial, almost imperceptible softening of the lips to the malevolent grin to the weeping tear, detailing the time-lapse footage, the strange scent, the dizzy spells, and the unnerving connection I felt to the portrait. I spoke for nearly an hour, pouring out weeks of fear and confusion, the words tumbling out in a torrent. Professor Finch listened patiently, interjecting only with an occasional fascinating or indeed. When I finished, the line was silent for a moment. I held my breath, waiting for his dismissal, his gentle suggestion that I seek professional help. "Clara," he finally said, his voice grave, "this is extraordinary and deeply troubling. You did well to document it, and you did even better to call me." A wave of profound relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought tears to my eyes. He believed me. He actually believed me. "I have heard whispers of such things, of course," he continued, "but never with such verifiable documentation. A living painting, it's the stuff of legends, Clara, or profound spiritual phenomena. The details you've unearthed about Blackwood's interest in the occult, the local folklore, the unusual collection, it all points to something far more complex than simple psychological projection." "What do I do, Professor?" I asked, my voice small. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I'm afraid to be alone with it. You are not alone now, Clara, he said, his voice firm. First, do not approach the painting without your camera recording. If it interacts with you, try to remain calm. Do not touch it. Do not attempt to communicate with it directly, at least not yet. We don't know what we're dealing with. I have to go to work tomorrow, I said, a fresh wave of dread washing over me. I can't just avoid it. No, you can't, but you can be prepared. I will begin my own research tonight, cross-referencing everything you've told me with my archives. I have a few obscure texts on animate art, object possession, and certain rituals involving portraiture that might shed some light. This will take time. For now, continue your routine, but with extreme caution, and keep recording. Rituals, I repeated, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Indeed, some cultures, particularly those with strong animistic beliefs, believed that a portrait could become a vessel, a mirror, or even a prison for a soul. Sometimes through deliberate ritual, sometimes through intense emotional attachment or traumatic events occurring in its presence. Your Mr. Blackwood seems to fit the bill for the latter, at least initially. But it's changing for me, I said, a desperate need for understanding in my voice. It seems to react to my presence. That is most curious, he mused. Perhaps it senses your sensitivity, your connection to art, your youth, your isolation, or perhaps it perceives you as a potential conduit, a means to an end. We need to understand its intentions, Clara. Is it malevolent? Is it trapped? Or is it simply seeking to continue its existence through observation and manipulation? His words sent a shiver down my spine. Manipulating me for what? We don't know yet, but an entity that can affect your physical state with a scent, that can weep, that can change its entire demeanor based on who is present. It is powerful, Clara, more powerful than a mere painting. It is an active consciousness, and you, my dear, have inadvertently stumbled into its private world. What if Mrs. Gable finds out about my recordings? I asked, a new worry emerging, or sees me talking to it. Keep your head down, Clara. Maintain your professional demeanor. The last thing we need is for Mrs. Gable to deem you unstable and remove you from the gallery. You are our only observer, our only link to this phenomenon. If she were to become suspicious, it would only make matters more difficult. I'll try, I said, though the thought of facing the portrait again tomorrow, knowing what I now knew, filled me with a profound sense of terror. I will be in Oakhaven as soon as I can, Clara, Professor Finch promised. It will take me a few days to make arrangements, but I intend to see this for myself. Until then, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, knowledge is your greatest weapon against the unknown. We ended the call, and I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the phone still clutched in my hand. Professor Finch's words, though reassuring in their belief, also amplified the danger. An active consciousness, rituals, manipulation. I was no longer just an art history graduate. I was an unwitting participant in a supernatural drama, trapped between a painting and a world unwilling to believe. Sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the time-lapse footage, pausing on the weeping tear, zooming in, trying to discern something more. Was there a glint of malevolence even in that desperate sorrow, a hidden agenda behind the suffering? The lines around his mouth, the tilt of his head, it was all so deliberate, so precisely articulated. This was no random shift, it was a performance. The sweet metallic scent, which I now associated with the painting's heightened activity, seemed to linger faintly in my apartment, or perhaps it was just my imagination. My head throbbed and my stomach churned with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. When the first streaks of dawn lightened my window, I felt a bone-deep exhaustion. But I knew I couldn't afford to be tired. I had to face it again. I had to continue my observations, armed with my camera and the slim hope that Professor Finch would arrive before things escalated beyond my control. I dressed in my gallery uniform, a sensible navy skirt and white blouse, feeling like a warrior donning armor. I packed an extra battery for my camera, a small bottle of water, and a few granola bars. I felt a desperate need to be prepared, to have some semblance of control in a situation that was spiraling rapidly out of it. Leaving my apartment, the air felt colder, the town quieter than usual. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every creak of the old floorboards in the gallery seemed like a warning. I was acutely aware of my isolation, the heavy weight of the knowledge I now carried. As I approached the Oakhaven Municipal Gallery, its imposing facade, usually a symbol of quiet heritage, now loomed like a haunted mansion. The heavy oak doors, the ancient alarm system, they felt less like protection and more like a barrier, locking me in with the unknown. I went through my routine automatically, unlocking, disarming, making my way through the silent halls. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet. I held my breath, my hand hovering over the doorknob of the main hall. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back, to flee, to pretend I had never seen a thing. But Professor Finch's words echoed in my mind. Knowledge is your greatest weapon, and you are our only observer, our only link. I couldn't abandon the post, not now, not when help was finally on its way. I pushed the door open, the sound resonating in the cavernous space. The morning light filtered through the tall, arched windows, cast long, distorted shadows across the polished wooden floor. The air was still, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, but beneath it I could almost imagine that cloying, sweet, metallic aroma lingering, a ghost of yesterday's terror. My gaze was drawn immediately to the portrait. It hung there, innocent and unassuming, exactly as it had appeared when Mrs. Gable interrupted my discovery of the triumphant smile, and exactly as it reverted after its weeping spell. The stern, unreadable expression was back, the thin lips a severe line, the murky brown eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. It was the face of a man carved from stone, impassive, impenetrable. But I knew better. I knew the secrets it held, the emotions it could conjure, the tears it could shed, and I knew it was watching me even now with its painted, unchanging gaze. A shiver ran through me despite my resolve. I set up my camera on the tripod, my movements precise, methodical. The click of the tripod legs, the whir of the lens adjusting, small mechanical sounds in the vast silence. I positioned it carefully, ensuring the entire painting was within the frame, then pressed record. The tiny red light glowed, a silent sentinel. I wished I could leave it there, let it stand guard alone, but I had duties. I retreated, forcing myself to turn my back on the painting to begin my usual rounds. I checked the humidity, adjusted a crooked plaque, ensured the gift shop display was still impeccably organized for now. But my mind was not on my tasks. It was on the main hall, on the silent observer, on the camera patiently recording. Mrs. Gable arrived at her usual time, a brisk efficiency about her. "Good morning, Clara. You're looking a little less pale today. Did you get some rest?" "Good morning, Mrs. Gable. Yes, thank you, much better." I managed a smile, a practiced artifice. I wished my voice didn't sound quite so strained. She eyed me, then the camera. "Still documenting the Blackwood piece for your blog, dear. You're certainly dedicated, perhaps a little too dedicated." Don't let these old paintings consume you now." Her tone was light, but there was an underlying current of disapproval. "Just a passion project," I replied, forcing a laugh. "It's a fascinating period piece. I think the local history aspect could be quite compelling." She nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Indeed. Well, don't let it interfere with your duties. We have that school group arriving this afternoon, and I expect the colonial exhibit to be pristine." I spent the morning in a state of hyper-awareness, every nerve ending frayed. I could feel the painting's presence, a low thrumming energy that seemed to permeate the gallery. Every time I walked past the main hall, I resisted the urge to sprint, to look away. I kept my gaze forward, my expression neutral, as if it were just another piece of art, albeit one that filled me with an existential dread. The school group was a welcome distraction. A gaggle of excitable 10-year-olds, their chatter and laughter filled the gallery with a normalcy I desperately craved. I guided them through the exhibits, explaining the history of Oakhaven, pointing out the antique curiosities. As we approached the main hall, I felt my heart quicken. "And here we have a portrait of Mr. Elias Blackwood," I said, my voice carefully modulated. "A very important figure in Oakhaven's early history, a prominent merchant and landowner." The children, usually restless, fell silent. Their eyes, wide with youthful curiosity, were drawn to the painting. One boy, no older than 9, pointed. "Miss Clara," his eyes look like they're following me. A wave of relief and terror washed over me. Relief because someone else saw it. Terror because it was subtle enough not to alarm Mrs. Gable, who was at the back of the group, but distinct enough for a child to notice. "That's a clever trick artists used," I explained, forcing a smile. "It's designed to make you feel like he's always looking at you, no matter where you stand." "But he looks grumpy," a girl piped up, "like he ate a sour lemon." I almost laughed. "Indeed he does. He was a very serious man." Mrs. Gable, overhearing, added, "A stern but respectable man, children. Now, if we could move on to the antique farming tools." I ushered them away, my mind buzzing. Grumpy, like he ate a sour lemon. That was the original default setting. The painting was maintaining its facade for the general public, for Mrs. Gable, but it had revealed a glimpse of its potential to a child. And what had my camera recorded? The hours crawled by, the school group left, Mrs. Gable returned to her office, and the gallery settled back into its oppressive silence. As soon as I was alone, I rushed to the main hall, retrieving my camera. I felt an almost frantic urgency to review the footage. Back in the quiet sanctity of my apartment, I uploaded the day's recordings. My fingers trembled as I clicked play, fast-forwarding through the early morning, past my arrival, past Mrs. Gable's first appearance. The painting was quiet for a long time, holding its stern facade. Then, around 7:00 a.m., about 10 minutes after I had set up the camera and left the hall, the subtle shimmering began. The colors deepened, the lines sharpened, and then the transformation. This time, it wasn't a smile or a tear or a look of contemplation. It was a face etched with profound weariness, almost exhaustion. The eyes, slightly sunken, seemed to hold an ancient sorrow, and the corners of his mouth drooped. He looked utterly spent. But what was truly alarming was a faint, almost invisible, grayish tint that seemed to seep into his skin tone, making him appear sickly, almost cadaverous. I gasped, pressing my hand to my mouth. It looked as though he was slowly dying, or already dead. The gray tint grew more pronounced, making his powdered wig seem unnaturally white against his ashen face. The mournful, exhausted expression held for several minutes, the gray tint slowly receding before his features stiffened, reverting to the familiar grimness just before the first visitors or Mrs. Gable would have entered the hall. My mind raced. Weariness, sickness, death. What new layer was this? It was as if the painting was cycling through the stages of a life, or perhaps a death. First curiosity, then desperation, malevolence, sorrow, and now decline. I thought of Mr. Blackwood's sudden death from apoplexy at barely 50 and the unaccountable terror witnessed by his servants. Was the painting showing me his final moments, his suffering? Was it trying to convey a specific message about his demise? Professor Finch's words about the painting being a vessel or a prison for a soul echoed in my mind. If it was a prison, then this exhaustion and decay could be the prisoner's suffering. But if it was a vessel, capable of conscious thought, then this display could be a calculated act, another performance designed to elicit a specific response from me. I spent the rest of the night poring over the newly discovered footage, comparing it to previous recordings. The grayish tint was subtle, easily missed without careful observation, but undeniably there. It added a new, disturbing dimension to the painting's capabilities. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were a chaotic montage of Blackwood's shifting faces, the malevolent grin, the single tear, and now the ashen, dying visage. I woke in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of old potpourri and metallic sweetness clinging to my senses. The next day at the gallery was a blur of heightened anxiety. I felt a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need for Professor Finch to arrive. I followed my routine, setting up the camera, doing my rounds, but my focus was entirely on the main hall, on the silent canvas. That afternoon, Mrs. Gable called me into her office. My heart leaped into my throat. Had she noticed something? Had she reviewed my blog footage? "Clara, dear, do you know anything about the gallery's old service entrance?" she asked, her brow furrowed, pointing to a faded blueprint on her desk. The one near the old coal chute in the basement. I blinked, momentarily disoriented. The service entrance? I thought it was boarded up years ago, Mrs. Gable. "It was," she confirmed, "but it appears to be causing a minor issue. We've had some rather persistent drafts in the colonial exhibit, and the HVAC team suspects a breach near that old entrance. They're coming in tomorrow morning to inspect it." "Oh," I said, trying to sound helpful. "I'm not sure. I've never ventured down to that part of the basement." The gallery basement was a labyrinth of storage rooms, dusty archives, and disused utility spaces, a place Mrs. Gable usually forbade me to explore. "No, I don't expect you to," she replied, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "Just thought you might have heard something. You're always poking around in those old town records." She gave me a suspicious look. "Just don't go poking around in the basement. It's a health and safety hazard down there, full of mold and spider webs." I quickly assured her I wouldn't, but a seed of curiosity had been planted. The old coal chute, the service entrance, drafts in the colonial exhibit. The colonial exhibit was right next to the main hall. Could there be a connection? That night my research took a new turn. I focused on the gallery building itself, the old 19th century mansion. I found records detailing its construction, its original owners, and subsequent renovations. It had been built by a wealthy shipping magnate, a contemporary of Blackwood, who later fell into financial ruin. The mansion was then sold, passing through several hands before being donated to the town for conversion into a museum in the early 1900s. But what truly caught my attention was a footnote in one of the property records. The mansion's original owner, a man named Jeremiah Croft, had purchased a significant plot of land from Elias Blackwood shortly before Blackwood's death. The transaction was unusually swift, with Croft paying a surprisingly low price for such a prime piece of land. The document mentioned certain conditions attached to the sale, but these were vague and open to interpretation. Could there be a link between Blackwood, Croft, and the mansion? Could Blackwood's occult collection have found its way into the mansion's hidden recesses? The thought was chilling. The service entrance and coal chute Mrs. Gable mentioned suddenly took on a sinister resonance. Old houses, especially those with such a history, often had hidden rooms, secret passages. The next morning, I arrived at the gallery with a new sense of purpose, tinged with apprehension. I set up my camera as usual, then made my way to the colonial exhibit, which was indeed drafty. The HVAC team was already there, 2 men in overalls, shining flashlights into the dusty crevices of the wall. "Any luck?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just a bit," one of them grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Looks like there's a collapsed section of the old coal chute down in the basement, creating a direct airflow into this wing. It's pretty tight down there, though, and dark. Might need to send a camera probe in." I nodded, pretending interest, but my mind was elsewhere. The old coal chute, the basement, these were physical access points to the deepest, most forgotten parts of the building. And if Blackwood's influence truly permeated this place, these were the very places where his secrets might be buried. I spent my lunch break in the archives again, digging deeper into Jeremiah Croft. I found a few mentions of him being a fellow collector of curious objects, often sourcing rare imports through his shipping business. A small, tantalizing detail. Was it just a coincidence that Blackwood, with his interest in the occult, had sold land to another collector who built this very mansion? Suddenly my phone buzzed. It was Professor Finch. "Clara, my dear, I'm at the Oakhaven Inn. I just checked in. Can you meet me after the gallery closes tonight? We have much to discuss." His voice was low, urgent. A wave of relief so intense it made my knees weak washed over me. He was here. I wasn't alone anymore. "Yes, Professor, of course, I'll be there." The rest of the day was an agonizing wait. I went through the motions, performing my duties mechanically, my mind a whirlwind of anticipation and dread. What would Professor Finch discover in his research? What new horror would the painting reveal today? I reviewed the camera footage from the morning as soon as I got home. The painting had not changed as dramatically as the previous day. It held its stern, original expression for the entire recording. It was almost as if it knew Professor Finch was coming, as if it were deliberately withholding its true nature, biding its time. Or perhaps it was simply conserving its energy. Either way, it was a disconcerting display of apparent self-awareness. I met Professor Finch at the Oakhaven Inn's quaint, somewhat dated lounge. He was exactly as I remembered him. A tall, wiry man with an unruly shock of white hair, piercing blue eyes behind thick spectacles, and an air of perpetual scholarly rumination. He wore a tweed jacket that looked a few decades old and carried a battered leather satchel. He greeted me with a warm, if slightly distracted, smile. "Clara, my dear, thank you for coming. Please sit." I sank into a plush armchair, feeling utterly exhausted but also invigorated by his presence. Professor, I'm so glad you're here. I feel like I'm losing my mind. He waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense. You're an astute observer, Clara, and your documentation is invaluable. I've been reviewing your time-lapse footage, the weeping tear astonishing, the grayish pallor quite unsettling, and the fluctuating expressions, the sheer range of emotion displayed. This is no mere trick of the light. He pulled a thick, leather-bound book from his satchel, its pages yellowed and fragile. I've spent the last 2 days delving into some rather obscure texts. This one, Animus Pictus, the living image, dates back to the 17th century. It speaks of a rare, ancient ritual known as soul binding, predominantly practiced by certain esoteric societies in Europe, but with surprisingly similar analogues in indigenous cultures globally. My blood ran cold. Soul binding. Indeed, the ritual's purpose was to imbue an inanimate object, often a portrait or a statue, with a fragment of a person's soul, or sometimes to trap an entire soul within it. This could be done to preserve a loved one, to achieve a perverse form of immortality, or, more sinisterly, to punish an enemy, imprisoning them in a perpetual state of torment. He adjusted his spectacles, his blue eyes gleaming. The ritual required specific conditions, a powerful emotional catalyst, extreme love, hatred, or fear at the moment of creation or immediately after. It often involved a physical component, an anchor, such as a drop of blood, a lock of hair, or a personal belonging incorporated into the materials of the artwork. And critically, the subject of the portrait had to be unusually receptive. A person with a strong, often volatile spiritual presence. Mr. Blackwood, I whispered, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. A ruthless businessman, rumored to be interested in the occult, surrounded by whispers of disappearances and land acquired through dubious means. His wife died young, their child in infancy, and he himself died in unaccountable terror. Precisely, Professor Finch said, nodding slowly. His profile fits the unfortunate archetype perfectly. A man whose life was likely filled with extreme emotions, both given and received. A man who might have dabbled in the very occult practices capable of such a ritual, either on himself or perhaps, inadvertently, had it done to him. The unaccountable terror could have been the final, horrific moment of his soul being torn from his body and trapped, or perhaps the manifestation of the ritual's completion. But why that painting? I asked, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the gallery. Why not something else, a statue, another object? The portrait form is particularly potent, he explained. It captures a likeness, a visual representation of the individual. It's a mirror. The act of sitting for a portrait, being scrutinized by an artist, can be an intense psychological experience. If combined with the ritual, it creates a powerful conduit. And if the artist himself was complicit or had certain knowledge. Mr. Davies said the artist was a local talent, a journeyman painter from the late 1700s, but no name survived, I interjected, recalling Mrs. Gable's words. A common occurrence, he said. Professor Finch leaned forward, his eyes alight with a grim fascination. Or perhaps deliberately obscured. A journeyman painter with knowledge of such obscure rites would certainly wish to remain anonymous. This soul-binding ritual, while rare, was not entirely unknown to those on the fringes of society, particularly among those who believed in harnessing spiritual energy for power or vengeance. So is he trapped in the painting? I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. Is that why it's weeping, because he's suffering? That is one possibility, Professor Finch conceded. The expressions of sorrow, of weariness, the tear, they certainly suggest a being in torment, a soul trapped, reliving its despair. However, we must also consider the other possibility, that it is a malevolent entity deliberately manipulating your emotions, drawing you in. The triumphant smile, I recalled, a shiver running down my spine, the malicious glee. Exactly. A soul-bound entity, especially one bound in trauma or malice, could exhibit a wide range of emotions. It could be both victim and tormentor, suffering and inflicting suffering. Or perhaps what you're observing is not Mr. Blackwood's soul at all, but some other entity, some parasitic spirit that has taken root within the painting, feeding on the trapped soul, or even on the emotions of those who observe it. The idea made my blood run cold. A parasitic spirit. The subtle changes it displays when alone, then reverting to its stern default when others are present, he continued, suggests a degree of self-preservation, a desire not to be overtly discovered by those who might seek to neutralize it. It chose you, Clara, to reveal itself too. Your isolation, your ambition, your keen eye as an art historian, perhaps it recognized your potential as a conduit, a vessel through which it could finally act. Act how? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Professor Finch sighed, running a hand through his wild hair. That is the question, isn't it? The text suggests that over time, if unchecked, a soul-bound object can begin to exert influence over its surroundings. Minor poltergeist activity, objects moving, strange sounds. More powerfully, it can begin to feed on the vitality of those in its presence, slowly draining their energy, their will, their very life force. And in the most extreme cases, it can attempt to escape its confines or even to possess a living host. I felt a cold dread wash over me, possess a living host. My mind immediately flashed to my own dizzy spells, the sweet, cloying scent, the strange exhaustion. Was the painting already feeding on me? Was it preparing me to be its new vessel? Clara, the fact that you experienced physical symptoms, the dizziness, the nausea, the specific odor is highly concerning, Professor Finch said, his voice grave. It suggests a direct energetic interaction, a siphoning of your vital essence. You must be extremely careful. Do not, under any circumstances, allow yourself to be alone with it for extended periods without the camera. And do not, whatever you do, attempt to touch the canvas or any part of the frame. I haven't, I assured him, though the memory of running my hand over the cool wall near the painting that first day made me wince inwardly. Good, now you mentioned some intriguing details about the gallery building itself. The old mansion, Jeremiah Croft, the original owner, Blackwood's contemporary, a fellow collector of curious objects, and the land sale with certain conditions. This is a critical line of inquiry. He pulled out a small, well-worn notebook. I believe we need to investigate Jeremiah Croft more thoroughly. Did he acquire any of Blackwood's unusual collection of artifacts after Blackwood's death? Were these certain conditions related to the painting or perhaps to Blackwood's occult interests? It's possible Croft, too, was involved in the deeper machinations of this ritual, perhaps even benefiting from it. Mrs. Gable mentioned an old service entrance in the basement near a collapsed coal chute, I offered, remembering my earlier conversation. She said the HVAC team is inspecting it because of persistent drafts in the colonial exhibit right next to the main hall. Professor Finch's eyes widened. A basement service entrance, a collapsed coal chute. Clara, old mansions like this are rife with hidden passages, forgotten spaces. If Blackwood's occult collection existed, and if Croft was indeed a fellow collector and bought land from Blackwood, it's not a stretch to imagine some of those artifacts might have ended up in this very building. The presence of artifacts related to the ritual could amplify the painting's power or even serve as additional anchors for the trapped entity. He leaned back, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. The draft in the colonial exhibit suggests an opening, a pathway to these forgotten spaces. It is highly probable that the very heart of this phenomenon, the true source of its power, might lie hidden within the foundations of this gallery. This could be where the anchor for the soul-binding ritual is, if not within the painting itself, then somewhere in close proximity. But Mrs. Gable explicitly told me not to go into the basement, I confessed. She said it was a health and safety hazard. Under normal circumstances, I would advise you to obey, Professor Finch said grimly. But these are not normal circumstances. We need to find out what is down there. The HVAC team will be poking around. Could you assist them? I swallowed hard. The thought of venturing into the dusty, forbidden depths of the gallery basement, knowing what I now knew, filled me with a fresh wave of fear. But the alternative, remaining in the dark, allowing the painting to continue its sinister game, was even worse. I can try, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I could offer to help them identify old pipes or wiring diagrams from the archives, use that as an excuse to get down there. Excellent, Clara, he said, a rare smile touching his lips. You have a resourceful mind. Now, while you're doing that, I will spend tomorrow at the Oakhaven Historical Society. They have a more extensive collection of local family papers, private diaries, and town records. I'll focus on anything related to Blackwood, Croft, and any mention of unusual artifacts or disappearances beyond what you found. What about Mrs. Gable? I asked, if she sees you snooping around. I am merely a visiting scholar conducting research on Oakhaven's colonial artistic heritage, he said, his eyes twinkling. A perfectly legitimate cover. I will be discreet. In the meantime, continue to document everything the painting does and try to look for patterns. Does it react to specific times of day, to specific emotional states from you, any shift in the gallery's atmosphere? I nodded, feeling a strange mix of terror and determination. I was no longer just an assistant curator. I was an investigator, a reluctant ghost hunter. We talked for another hour, Professor Finch outlining various historical precedents for such phenomena, discussing theories of spiritual energy and how certain materials, like oil paints and ancient wood, might act as conductors. He also impressed upon me the need for extreme caution. This entity, whether Blackwood's soul or something else, is clearly powerful. Its ability to influence your senses and emotions is not to be underestimated. Protect yourself, Clara. Mentally, physically, don't engage it directly unless absolutely necessary. Observe, document, and report back to me. As I walked back to my apartment that night, the moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows. The Oakhaven Municipal Gallery, usually a comforting landmark, now seemed to brood under the moonlight, its dark windows like watchful eyes. I imagined Blackwood's painted face behind one of them, his shifting expressions reflecting the complex, dangerous game we were now engaged in. Sleep was still elusive. My mind was a maelstrom of soul-binding rituals, parasitic spirits, hidden basements, and the chilling thought that the painting was specifically targeting me. I kept seeing the grayish, dying face, the weeping tear, the malevolent grin. Each expression was a facet of a terrifying truth, a puzzle piece I was desperately trying to fit together. The next morning, armed with a carefully constructed excuse, I approached the HVAC team. Mrs. Gable asked me to assist you gentlemen if I can, I began, my voice as professional as possible. I'm familiar with the gallery's archives and old blueprints. Perhaps I can help you pinpoint the exact location of the old coal chute or any other hidden conduits. The lead technician, a gruff but amiable man named Frank, grunted. Be my guest, ma'am. It's a real rat's nest down here. Any extra eyes are welcome. He led me to the basement door, a heavy, unmarked oak panel tucked away behind a display of ancient farming equipment. As he unlatched it, a blast of cold, stale air, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, hit me. I hesitated, a wave of nausea washing over me, but I forced myself to step through. The basement was a sprawling, dimly lit space, a labyrinth of forgotten storage rooms, towering shelves laden with dusty artifacts, and an unsettling network of exposed pipes and conduits. Fluorescent lights flickering weakly cast long, dancing shadows, making every corner seem to hold a lurking presence. The air was heavy, oppressive. It felt ancient. Frank pointed to a section of crumbling brickwork near the far wall. That's it, the old coal chute. It's completely collapsed inwards. The draft is coming from a fissure in the rock face behind it. Looks like an old subterranean passage, maybe a natural cave system or even something man-made that's opened up. My heart pounded. A subterranean passage. This was it. This was what Professor Finch had hinted at, the hidden heart of the phenomenon. Do you mind if I just take a look around? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sometimes old buildings have diagrams scrawled on the walls or hidden access panels. It might help you get a clearer picture. Frank shrugged. Just watch your step and don't touch anything. Place is a health hazard. He and his team continued their work, muttering about airflow and insulation. I moved away from them, deeper into the shadows, a small flashlight clutched in my hand. The light beam cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of forgotten paintings, crated sculptures, and relics from Oakhaven's past, all quietly gathering dust. It felt like walking through a graveyard of forgotten histories. I started near the section where the colonial exhibit was directly above, working my way towards the collapsed coal chute. The air grew colder, the oppressive feeling intensifying. I felt a growing sense of being watched, a familiar prickle on the back of my neck. It was subtle, but undeniable. Suddenly, my flashlight beam caught something. Tucked away on a low shelf, half hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates, was a small, crudely carved wooden box. It was dark, almost black with age, and adorned with strange, angular symbols that looked vaguely familiar, almost like pictograms from some ancient, forgotten script. My hands trembled as I reached for it. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked, and the wood felt unusually dense and cold to the touch. As my fingers grazed the carvings, a faint tremor ran through the box. And then that sweet, metallic odor, now much stronger, assaulted my senses, making my head spin. Clara, you okay down there? Frank's voice boomed from the other end of the basement. Yes, fine, I called back, quickly pulling my hand away from the box. The scent dissipated almost immediately, leaving me feeling disoriented and lightheaded. I forced myself to calm down. I couldn't risk alarming Frank or Mrs. Gable. I needed to examine this box more closely, but not here, not now. I discreetly snapped a quick picture of the box with my phone, the symbols clearly visible. Then I continued my feigned search for blueprints, trying to appear nonchalant, but my mind was racing. The symbols, the strange scent, the sudden physical reaction, this had to be connected. This had to be one of Blackwood's unusual artifacts, perhaps even an anchor for the soul-binding ritual. I spent the next hour feigning diligence, occasionally offering Frank a plausible suggestion about old ventilation shafts, all the while resisting the urge to snatch the box and run. The more time I spent in the basement, the more pronounced the oppressive feeling became, the stronger the sense of an unseen presence. It felt like the very air was charged with something ancient and malevolent. When I finally escaped the basement, my head was throbbing, my clothes felt clammy, and my nerves were shot. I made my way to the main hall. The Blackwood portrait hung there, still and silent, its grim expression unchanging. But I could feel its gaze, now laced with something akin to satisfaction. As if it knew. As if it had witnessed my discovery in the basement and approved. That evening, I called Professor Finch, my voice trembling with suppressed excitement and fear. I described the basement, the collapsed coal chute leading to a subterranean passage, and most importantly, the carved wooden box with its strange symbols. I sent him the picture I'd taken. He listened intently, his breathing quickening as I spoke. The symbols, Clara, can you describe them? They're angular, geometric, almost like a primitive script, I explained. They remind me vaguely of some ancient petroglyphs I've seen, but more intricate, almost like a language. Fascinating, he breathed. I've just come from the Historical Society. I found some old letters written by Jeremiah Croft, to a reclusive scholar known for his interest in ethereal arts and ancient constructs. Croft mentions acquiring a certain chest from Blackwood, filled with curious devices and glyph-covered talismans that Blackwood believed held the key to extending one's spiritual essence beyond the corporeal form. He refers to Blackwood as a man dangerously close to mastering the forbidden arts, yet lacking the true discipline to control them. My blood ran cold. The key to extending one's spiritual essence, soul binding. Precisely, Professor Finch confirmed, and a chest filled with curious devices and glyph-covered talismans sounds exactly like your carved wooden box. It is almost certainly a part of Blackwood's occult collection, possibly the very focus of the soul-binding ritual, an anchor or amplifier that links his soul to the painting. What do I do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It's still down there. You must retrieve it, Clara, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. It is too dangerous to leave there, especially if the HVAC team exposes that subterranean passage. If that chest is indeed the anchor or contains artifacts that amplify the painting's power, then its removal could be the key to severing Blackwood's connection, or at least weakening his influence. But Mrs. Gable must not know, he interrupted. You must find a way. If it is as you describe those symbols, the physical symptoms you experienced, it is radiating a powerful energy. It must be isolated. Tonight, Clara, when the gallery is empty, you must go back down into that basement and bring it out. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Go back into the basement, alone, in the dark, to retrieve a potentially cursed artifact. Once you have it, he continued, do not open it. Do not attempt to decipher the symbols yourself. Wrap it in thick cloth, ideally natural fiber like linen or cotton, to contain its energy. Bring it to my room at the Oakhaven Inn. I have certain countermeasures we can attempt. Countermeasures? Countermeasures for what, Professor? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, the word chilling me to the bone. To contain it, Clara, to neutralize its malevolent influence, at least temporarily. I have some ancient methods passed down through generations of scholars who dared to tread in these esoteric territories. But first, you must get it out, tonight, alone. The line clicked dead in my ear. Professor Finch had hung up, leaving me suspended in a terrifying void of silence and command. Go back into the basement, alone in the dark, to retrieve a potentially cursed artifact. My blood ran cold, then pulsed with a frantic energy. It was one thing to be an observer, another to be an active participant in something so profoundly unsettling. I stood there for a long moment, the phone still clutched in my hand, its plastic casing cool against my clammy palm. The silence of my apartment, usually a comfort, now felt heavy, pressing in on me. The moon, a pale orb outside my window, cast long spectral shadows across the floorboards. The Oakhaven Municipal Gallery, visible in the distance, loomed like a dark, watchful beast, its windows like empty eyes. I imagined Blackwood's painted face behind one of them, his shifting expressions reflecting the complex, dangerous game we were now engaged in. Fear, cold and visceral, clawed at my throat. It screamed at me to refuse, to pretend I hadn't heard, to simply walk away from this escalating nightmare. But Professor Finch's words, his unwavering conviction, echoed in my mind. It is too dangerous to leave there. It must be isolated. And then the image of Blackwood's gray, dying face, the single, weeping tear, the triumphant, malevolent grin, they all flashed before my eyes. This wasn't just about a painting anymore. It was about something ancient, something evil, lurking beneath the very foundations of the gallery, and it was demanding attention. If not me, then who? If not now, then when, before it grew too powerful to contain. A strange sense of resolve began to crystallize within me, hardening the edges of my fear. I had stumbled into this, yes, but I wouldn't cower. I wouldn't be its next victim or its unwilling conduit. Knowledge, Professor Finch had said, was my greatest weapon, and I was about to arm myself with more of it, no matter the cost. I started to move, my actions jerky and uncertain at first, then gaining a grim purpose. I changed into dark clothes, black jeans, a long-sleeved dark shirt, something that wouldn't draw attention in the moonlight or show dust from the basement. I pulled my hair back into a tight bun out of the way. I needed to be practical, efficient. Next, I gathered my tools. A sturdy flashlight, fully charged, its beam a comforting weight in my hand. A pair of thick gardening gloves for protection against the dust and whatever else might be clinging to that box. And a large linen tablecloth I usually reserved for special occasions, now destined to wrap a potentially cursed artifact. I folded it carefully, making sure it was substantial enough to contain whatever emanated from the carved wood. I also grabbed my phone, fully charged, ready to call Professor Finch at a moment's notice, or at least to use its light if my main flashlight failed. And of course, my small camera, its recording light a beacon of my scientific, if terrified, approach. I checked the time, almost 10 p.m. Mrs. Gable would have gone home hours ago. The gallery would be utterly deserted. The thought sent another shiver down my spine, but I pushed it away. There was no time for hesitation. Securing my apartment, I stepped out into the crisp night air. Oakhaven was quiet, most lights in the surrounding houses already extinguished. The street lamps cast long, distorted shadows, making familiar trees and bushes seem alien, menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog bark made me jump. I felt acutely exposed, as if the very air was watching me. The short walk to the gallery felt interminable. Each step took me closer to the unknown, to the heart of the creeping dread that had infiltrated my life. As I approached the imposing facade, its dark windows loomed like unblinking eyes. The heavy oak doors, usually so familiar, now seemed to mock me, a barrier between the mundane world and the nightmare within. My hands trembled as I unlocked the main door, the ancient mechanism groaning in protest. The sound echoed eerily in the silent night. I disarmed the alarm system, the familiar sequence of beeps a hollow comfort. Then I stepped inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind me with a decisive thud that seemed to seal my fate. The main hall was plunged into near darkness, only faint moonlight filtering through the tall, arched windows, casting ghostly patterns on the polished floor. The air was colder than outside, thick with the scent of old wood and dust, and a faint, almost imperceptible hint of that cloying, metallic sweetness that now signified danger. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I didn't dare turn on the main gallery lights. The fewer disturbances, the better. My flashlight beam cut a narrow swathe through the gloom, making the familiar exhibits appear sinister, distorted. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch me with judgmental gazes, their painted eyes following my every move. I forced myself to ignore them to focus on my mission, but I couldn't help but glance towards the Blackwood portrait hanging at the far end of the hall. In the dim light, it was just a dark rectangle on the wall, inscrutable, menacing in its stillness. I felt its presence, a cold, heavy weight in the air, a silent acknowledgement of my return. It knew what I was here for. I moved swiftly, silently, past the main exhibits, towards the unassuming door that led to the basement. It was tucked away behind a display of colonial-era farming equipment, an innocuous oak panel that hid the entrance to the gallery's deepest, darkest secrets. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the heavy iron latch. It was cold, slick with a fine film of dust. With a soft click, the latch gave way. I pulled the door open, revealing a steep wooden staircase that plunged into an abyss of inky blackness. A blast of cold, stale air, thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and something else, something metallic and vaguely organic, hit me, even stronger than before. It was the same odor that accompanied the painting's activity, but now it was raw, unfiltered, like a direct exhalation from the earth itself. I recoiled slightly, fighting a wave of nausea. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam piercing the darkness, revealing dust motes dancing in the air like ghostly particles. The stairs creaked ominously under my weight as I began my descent, each step echoing loudly in the subterranean silence. My heart was a frantic drum, adrenaline surging through my veins. The basement was even more daunting by flashlight than it had been in the partial light of day. The flickering fluorescent tubes that Frank had used were off, leaving the vast space in absolute darkness, save for the narrow cone of my beam. The labyrinthine shelves, filled with forgotten artifacts and crated sculptures, now seemed to press in on me, forming a suffocating maze. The pipes and conduits crisscrossing the ceiling looked like grasping skeletal arms. I moved with extreme caution, my senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence. Every creak and groan of the old building was amplified, turning into imagined whispers, scurrying footsteps. The oppressive feeling I'd experienced earlier was now magnified tenfold, a suffocating blanket of ancient malice. It was as if the basement itself was alive, a dormant entity disturbed by my intrusion. I navigated my way through the towering shelves, past forgotten portraits wrapped in canvas, past disused display cases, my flashlight sweeping across the dusty surfaces. I kept my eyes peeled, searching for landmarks, trying to retrace my steps from earlier that day. The collapsed coal chute was my target, and the low shelf where I'd found the box. The air grew progressively colder as I neared the area. My breath plumed in front of me, little white clouds in the beam of my light. The metallic, organic smell grew stronger, filling my nostrils, making my stomach churn. It was the scent of old blood, of something ancient and vital, yet also decaying. It was the smell of the painting, yes, but also the smell of whatever was truly at its source down here in the cold earth. Finally, my flashlight beam landed on the section of crumbling brickwork near the far wall, the collapsed coal chute. And there it was, tucked away on the low shelf, half hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates, the small, dark, crudely carved wooden box. It seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible aura in the gloom, drawing my eye like a magnet. The strange, angular symbols on its surface seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light, almost as if they were alive, whispering silent warnings. My hands trembled violently as I pulled on the thick gardening gloves. Despite the chill of the basement, a bead of sweat trickled down my temple. This was it, the moment of truth. I reached for the box, my movement slow, deliberate. As my gloved fingers brushed against the dark, dense wood, a tremor, far more potent than before, ran through it. It wasn't just a vibration, it felt like a silent shriek, an energetic pulse that vibrated through my bones, making my teeth ache. The sweet metallic odor intensified, overwhelming my senses, making my head spin violently. This time it was almost intoxicating, seductive, yet undeniably sinister. I felt a sudden, powerful pull, as if the box was trying to draw me closer, to absorb me into its ancient, forbidden embrace. My knees buckled, and I clutched at a nearby shelf to steady myself, my breath catching in my throat. This was no ordinary artifact. This was a living, breathing receptacle of something ancient and malevolent. Professor Finch's words echoed, "Do not, under any circumstances, allow yourself to be alone with it for extended periods. Do not attempt to touch the canvas or any part of the frame." He hadn't said don't touch the box, but the energy emanating from it was undeniable. I forced myself to breathe shallow, ragged breaths. I had to be strong, I had to focus. With renewed resolve, I grasped the box firmly, pulling it free from its dusty hiding place. It was heavier than I remembered, its weight solid and chilling in my gloved hands. As I lifted it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a deep sigh or a rustle of dry leaves, seemed to emanate from the collapsed coal chute behind it, from the fissure that led to the subterranean passage. It was as if the very earth was reacting to its removal, a disturbance in an ancient slumber. Clutching the box tightly, I turned, my heart hammering. I couldn't stay here another second. The oppressive feeling, the cold, the smell, it was all too much. I needed to get out. I retraced my steps through the labyrinthine basement, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me, revealing the shadowy path. The box felt like a living thing in my hands, a pulsating organ, radiating cold energy even through the thick gloves. I fought the urge to run, knowing that a misstep in this treacherous darkness could be disastrous. Finally, I reached the wooden stairs, practically scrambling up them, desperate to escape the suffocating gloom. The main hall felt like a sanctuary, even in its moonlit darkness. I quickly shut and latched the basement door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, catching my breath. The silence of the main hall, though still heavy, felt less oppressive now. The metallic scent seemed to recede, replaced by the familiar aroma of old wood and dust. But as I glanced towards the Blackwood portrait, I saw it. It wasn't a dramatic shift, not like the weeping tear or the malevolent grin. But in the faint moonlight, the lines around his eyes seemed to have deepened, etched with a new intensity. And his thin lips, usually a severe line, were now curled into the faintest, almost imperceptible smirk, a look of satisfaction, of triumph, as if it knew I had taken the box and this was all part of its grand design. A fresh wave of terror washed over me. Had I done the right thing, or had I simply played directly into its hands, releasing a piece of its power, allowing it to begin the next stage of its malevolent plan? I quickly unwrapped the linen tablecloth, carefully encasing the carved wooden box within its folds. I secured it tightly, creating a makeshift bundle. The linen, however, did little to mute the chilling cold that still emanated from the box. It was a cold that seeped into my bones, a cold that felt unnatural, ancient. Clutching the bundled box, I made my way to the main entrance, my movements precise and swift. I disarmed the alarm, unlocked the heavy oak door, and slipped out into the relative safety of the Oakhaven night. The cool air on my face felt like a blessing, clearing my head, chasing away some of the suffocating dread of the basement. I walked quickly, almost ran through the quiet streets, the wrapped box clutched tightly to my chest. My mind raced, filled with a tumultuous mix of fear, adrenaline, and a strange, almost manic exhilaration. I had done it. I had retrieved the artifact. Now to Professor Finch. The Oakhaven Inn was only a few blocks away. I reached its quaint, well-lit entrance, feeling a profound sense of relief. The warm glow of the lobby, the muted sounds of a television from a distant room, they were anchors to sanity, pulling me back from the brink of the supernatural abyss. I made my way to Professor Finch's room on the second floor, my heart still thrumming. I knocked softly, then more insistently. After a moment, I heard movement inside and the door opened a crack. Professor Finch peered out, his unruly white hair even more disheveled than usual, his thick spectacles perched low on his nose. His piercing blue eyes, however, were wide awake, alight with anticipation. "Clara, you have it," he exclaimed, his voice a hushed whisper, pulling me inside and quickly closing the door behind us. The room was cozy, filled with books and papers scattered across every surface. A small table in the center was cleared, a thick, dark velvet cloth spread over it. On the cloth lay an assortment of strange objects, small, intricately carved silver amulets, several vials of what looked like dried herbs and powders, a beeswax candle, and a shallow bowl filled with what appeared to be coarse sea salt. It looked like a setup for a ritual, not a scholarly endeavor. "Professor, I think it's even worse than we thought," I whispered, my voice still shaky. I placed the wrapped box on the velvet cloth, careful to avoid direct contact with the other items. The cold emanating from it was palpable, even through the linen. Professor Finch wasted no time. He immediately began to unwrap the box, his movements precise and deliberate. As the linen fell away, revealing the dark, carved wood, the strange, angular symbols seemed to pulse almost visibly in the soft lamplight. The metallic, sweet scent, though less intense than in the basement, still filled the room, making my head feel light. "Magnificent," he breathed, his voice filled with a scholarly awe that belied the danger of the object. He didn't touch it directly, instead using a pair of small, silver tongs to gently turn it, examining every side. These symbols, they are indeed a unique blend. Ancient Sumerian, mixed with some indigenous North American pictograms, and a dash of something I can only describe as purely Blackwood's own invention. A language of control, of binding. He then dipped a finger into a small vial of clear, viscous liquid and carefully drew a symbol on the side of the box over one of the existing glyphs. The liquid shimmered, then seemed to be absorbed by the wood. As he did so, the box vibrated faintly, and the air in the room seemed to crackle with an unseen energy. A sharp, almost painful pressure built behind my eyes. "What are you doing?" I asked, a tremor in my voice. "Applying a temporary counterglyph derived from ancient protective rituals," he explained without looking up. "It's meant to disrupt the outward flow of its energy, to dampen its influence, to make it dormant for a time." He repeated the process on all four sides of the box, muttering under his breath in a language I didn't recognize, a series of low, guttural incantations. With each counterglyph, the pulsating energy from the box seemed to diminish, the metallic scent fading slightly, the pressure in my head easing. Finally, he placed the box carefully in the center of the velvet cloth. Then he took a pinch of the coarse sea salt and sprinkled it in a circle around the box, creating a protective barrier. He lit the beeswax candle, placing it strategically at one corner of the salt circle. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "There," he said, stepping back, a look of strained relief on his face. "That should hold it, temporarily at least. It will contain its more immediate active influence." He wiped his hands on a clean handkerchief, then turned to me. "Clara, you did exceptionally well. This is indeed the heart of the matter. This box, I suspect, is not merely an anchor, but a control mechanism. Blackwood's own attempt at immortality, perhaps, or a way to bind something else entirely." "What did you find at the Historical Society?" I asked, eager for more information, the image of Blackwood's triumphant smirk still haunting me. Professor Finch gestured for me to sit on one of the armchairs, taking another himself. More than I could have hoped for. The letters from Jeremiah Croft to his reclusive scholar friend were a goldmine. Croft was indeed a fellow collector, but also a cautious man. He was fascinated by Blackwood's occult studies, yet also deeply wary of them. He describes Blackwood's experiments as reckless, dabbling in forces beyond his comprehension. He refers to a particular artifact, a living vessel that Blackwood intended to use to transcend mortal bounds. He also mentions a series of violent disagreements between Blackwood and a local indigenous elder, a wise woman named Ayana. Blackwood, it seems, had acquired several sacred artifacts from the local tribes under dubious circumstances, believing they held powerful spiritual energies. Ayana apparently warned him that he was disturbing the ancient spirits and would reap what he sowed. Blackwood ignored her, of course, Professor Finch continued, a grim look on his face. Croft's letters suggest that Blackwood, in his arrogance, was attempting to combine a European soul-binding ritual with elements of indigenous spiritual practices, believing he could harness their combined power for his own ends. He saw the portrait, his own likeness, as the ideal living vessel for this new hybrid ritual. "So the painting, it was meant to be his eternal home," I whispered, my gaze drawn to the now dormant box on the table. "Perhaps, but Croft's final letter is the most revealing and the most chilling. He describes Blackwood's death not as natural apoplexy, but as a violent internal struggle. His body racked with convulsions, his eyes wide with a terror not of this world," Croft wrote. "It was as if his very soul was being torn asunder, half seeking escape, half being dragged into the painted void." Croft believed Blackwood's ritual went catastrophically wrong, that the painting became a prison not just for Blackwood, but for something else he had awakened and tried to control. "Something else," I repeated, my blood running cold, "the parasitic spirit." Indeed, the unaccountable terror his servants witnessed, Croft attributed it not to Blackwood's suffering, but to the entity that was unleashed or perhaps trapped alongside him. A malevolent spirit, an ancient presence perhaps associated with the stolen indigenous artifacts that Blackwood tried to bind, but instead became bound with him or even to him within the painting. It is feeding on his soul, and through the painting, it is feeding on the energy of the living. The shifting expressions, I mused, putting the pieces together. The weeping, the exhaustion that could be Blackwood's torment. The malevolent grin, the satisfaction that could be the other entity, the parasitic spirit reveling in its power and the suffering of its host. "Precisely, Clara. You are a quick study," Professor Finch nodded. This box, these glyphs, I believe they are not only key to containing Blackwood, but also to understanding and perhaps neutralizing this parasitic entity. He carefully picked up a silver amulet from the table, a circular disc intricately engraved with a star-like symbol. I believe this is one of Croft's countermeasures he mentions. He seemed to have a collection of protective charms he acquired after Blackwood's death, perhaps as a way to safeguard himself from the forces Blackwood unleashed. He also wrote of the stolen artifacts, Professor Finch continued, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. He mentioned specifically a collection of 3 obsidian mirrors said to capture reflections of the true self, and a ceremonial bone flute, whispered to call forth echoes from the spirit world. He describes Blackwood's obsession with these items, believing they were essential components for his ultimate transcendence ritual. Croft, after Blackwood's death, felt compelled to safeguard these items, and secured them away in a hidden chamber within the very mansion Thaw. T is now your gallery. My jaw dropped. A hidden chamber, like the subterranean passage in the basement. It's highly likely, Professor Finch confirmed. The descriptions align perfectly. Croft, wary of Blackwood's unfinished rituals and the latent power in the artifacts, likely interred them in a place he believed safe and sealed away from the world. A chamber, perhaps, that was only recently breached by that collapsed coal chute. The source of the drafts, the ancient chill you felt, it's the energy emanating from these artifacts, and perhaps from the entity that Blackwood awakened. So the obsidian mirrors and the bone flute are still down there, I asked, a fresh wave of trepidation washing over me. In that subterranean passage. Most likely, and this makes your task even more critical, Clara. This box is the first step, but we need to find those other artifacts, especially if they are amplifying the painting's power or holding some part of the parasitic entity's essence. But Mrs. Gable explicitly forbade me from going into the basement, I protested, remembering her warning. And now the box is gone, she'll notice it missing. She won't, not immediately, Professor Finch dismissed with a wave of his hand. It was tucked away, forgotten for decades, and the basement is a labyrinth of forgotten things. What she will notice, however, is the HVAC team's continued work. This gives you cover. You've already established yourself as the helpful assistant curator knowledgeable about blueprints. The HVAC team found the subterranean passage, Professor, I recounted. They're going to send in a camera probe. Professor Finch's eyes widened. Excellent, this is our window of opportunity, Clara. While they are focused on their task, probing the passage, you can use the distraction to try and locate this hidden chamber. Croft's letters imply it was well concealed, but given the passage has already been breached, it might be more accessible than he intended. You want me to go back down there? I asked, the memory of the basement's oppressive chill and the box's powerful aura still fresh in my mind. Only if absolutely necessary and only with extreme caution, he clarified. We need to identify the other artifacts. If the camera probe reveals anything unusual, anything resembling Blackwood's curious devices, we must act, but we must be strategic. We cannot simply burst in there. He paused, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. Clara, this entity in the painting, it has clearly recognized you as its primary observer. It has revealed itself to you. It is trying to communicate, perhaps to manipulate, perhaps to seek release, or perhaps to simply feed. Your sensitivity to it, your isolation in the gallery, it's all part of its plan. We must turn that to our advantage. How? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the task. By understanding its intentions, by learning its patterns, by using the knowledge we gather to counteract its power, this box with its counterglyphs will buy us some time, but it's only the beginning. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious tone. I will need to study the glyphs on this box further. There may be specific incantations or reverse rituals that can truly neutralize the soul binding. This will take me a day or two. In the meantime, you must continue your observation. Your camera is crucial. Record everything. If the painting reacts to the absence of the box or to the presence of the HVAC team near the passage, we need to know. And if the HVAC team finds the artifacts, I asked. Then we will have to improvise, he said grimly. But for now, focus on observing. And should you feel compelled to re-enter the basement, I will be here should you need me. But do not be reckless, Clara. The forces at play here are ancient and immensely powerful. You are dealing with something that defies rational explanation. We spoke for another hour, Professor Finch detailing specific precautions I should take, explaining how to mentally shield myself from the painting's influence, visualizing a protective barrier, focusing on mundane tasks, and urging me to maintain a semblance of normalcy at the gallery to avoid Mrs. Gable's suspicion. He promised to delve into the meaning of the symbols on the box and research any known rituals related to the artifacts Croft mentioned. As I left the Oakhaven Inn, the moon had begun its descent, casting even longer, more distorted shadows. The town was still, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. I clutched my bag, feeling the weight of the new knowledge, the new dangers. The carved wooden box, now dormant but still radiating a faint, unnatural cold, sat securely in Professor Finch's room, a temporary reprieve. But the painting still hung in the gallery, and the subterranean passage still held its ancient secrets. Sleep once again was impossible. My mind churned with Professor Finch's revelations. Blackwood's disastrous hybrid ritual, the awakening of a parasitic spirit, the stolen artifacts hidden in a forgotten chamber beneath the gallery. It was a tale far more intricate and terrifying than I could have imagined. I pictured the obsidian mirrors, the bone flute. What dark purpose had Blackwood intended for them? What powers did they truly hold? And what would happen if they were disturbed, or worse, if they amplified the parasitic spirit's influence even further? I woke the next morning feeling utterly drained, yet a strange sense of purpose propelled me forward. I dressed in my sensible uniform, packed my camera with fresh batteries, and made my way to the gallery. The building seemed to watch me, its dark windows reflecting the gray dawn sky. I went through the unlocking and disarming routine automatically, my senses on high alert. The main hall was just as I had left it. Dim, silent, and permeated by that low thrumming energy I now recognized as the painting's presence. My gaze immediately fell on the Blackwood portrait. It hung there, stern and impenetrable, its default expression firmly in place. But I felt a subtle shift, a change in the air around it. It felt quieter, less aggressive than before. The absence of the box in the basement had clearly had an effect, even if it was just a temporary dampening. This gave me a small measure of hope. I set up my camera, making sure the red light glowed, then began my rounds. The HVAC team was already there, their equipment spread across the colonial exhibit. Frank, the lead technician, greeted me with a nod. "Morning, Clara. We're about to send the probe down the chute. Wanna see some live video feed from the bowels of the earth?" he joked, gesturing to a small monitor set up on a trolley. My heart leaped. This was it. "I'd be fascinated, Frank," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "I'm always interested in the building's hidden structures." I watched as one of the technicians, a younger man named Mark, fed a long, flexible cable with a camera head attached into the gaping maw of the collapsed coal chute. On the monitor, a grainy black-and-white image flickered to life. The camera descended into darkness, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The image became clearer, revealing a narrow, uneven tunnel. It was definitely man-made, or at least significantly widened, carved roughly from the rock face. The walls were damp, glistening with moisture, and occasionally dark, root-like tendrils snaked across the stone. Looks like an old service tunnel, maybe for a forgotten drainage system, Frank mused, peering at the screen. Or maybe an escape tunnel from the old days. These mansions always had their secrets. My mind raced. A hidden chamber, Croft's description. This had to be it. The camera continued its descent, the tunnel widening in some places, narrowing in others. We saw remnants of old wooden supports, long rotted away, and patches of what looked like ancient, dried moss. The air down there must have been incredibly still, incredibly old. Suddenly, the image on the screen flickered, then spun wildly. "Whoa, what was that?" Mark exclaimed, wrestling with the cable. "Looks like a partial collapse or some debris," Frank said, leaning closer. "See if you can get around it, Mark." Mark struggled with the probe, the image on the screen wobbling, then clearing. And there it was. Not a collapse, but a small, rectangular opening in the rock face, partially obscured by rubble and overgrown roots. It looked like a doorway, crudely cut into the stone. My breath hitched. "Frank, what is that?" I asked, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. Frank squinted. Looks like a sealed-off recess. Maybe an old storage alcove, too small for a full passage, probably. But I knew better. This was the hidden chamber. The camera probe, guided by Mark, maneuvered closer to the opening. As it did, the image on the screen began to distort, tiny lines of static appearing like a veil of interference. And then a flicker of light, not from the camera's own LED, but from within the chamber. A faint, reddish glow pulsating softly, almost imperceptibly. "Is that a light down there?" Mark asked, his voice puzzled. "Didn't think there'd be power." "Must be some kind of mineral deposit, phosphorescence," Frank scoffed, ever the pragmatist. "Or maybe just a trick of the light. Get us a closer look, Mark." As the probe edged closer to the opening, the reddish glow became more distinct. And then, through the static and the gloom, I saw them. 3 distinct shapes gleaming dully in the reddish light. 3 small, dark, oblong objects reflecting the light like polished stones. "The obsidian mirrors," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What was that, Clara?" Frank asked, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Nothing, just fascinating," I replied, forcing a smile. My mind was racing. This was it, the other artifacts. Mark managed to nudge the probe into the opening. The chamber was small, roughly square, and its walls appeared to be carved directly from the bedrock. And there, on a crude stone pedestal in the center, bathed in the faint, reddish luminescence, sat the 3 obsidian mirrors. They were perfectly smooth, polished to a dark sheen, and they seemed to absorb and reflect the strange light with an almost hypnotic quality. Next to them, lying almost casually on the pedestal, was a long, thin object that could only be one thing. A bone flute, its surface intricately carved, its ends darkened with age. The image on the screen was now clear and utterly chilling. The obsidian mirrors and the bone flute, just as Croft had described. and the reddish glow, it seemed to emanate directly from them, a faint, malevolent pulse. Suddenly, the screen went black. "Lost the feed," Mark exclaimed, jiggling the cable. "Must have hit a patch of interference or the battery died." "Damn it," Frank grumbled. "Well, that's enough for today. We know it's there. We'll need to secure the area, maybe get a proper exploratory team down here next week. No sense risking equipment in that tight space." My mind was reeling. They had seen it. They knew it was there, and they were going to come back for it. This meant the window of opportunity was closing. I quickly excused myself, feigning a sudden need to check on the colonial exhibit's humidity levels. My heart was pounding, a desperate urgency now overriding all other emotions. I needed to talk to Professor Finch. Immediately. I called him from the relative privacy of the gift shop, my voice hushed and urgent. I recounted everything. Professor Finch answered on the second ring, his voice sharp with anticipation. "Clara, what did you find?" "Professor, they found it," I blurted, my voice barely a whisper, even though I was alone in the quiet gift shop. The HVAC team with their camera probe. They went down the coal chute into the subterranean passage, and they found a hidden chamber. Inside were the 3 obsidian mirrors and the bone flute, just as Croft described. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The artifacts, and they're still down there. "Yes, but the camera feed cut out, and Frank said they're stopping for the day. They're going to secure the area and send a proper exploratory team down there next week," I explained, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Next week is too late, Clara." Professor Finch's voice was grim, devoid of its usual scholarly detachment. "If those items are exposed, or worse, if that exploratory team disturbs them without proper precautions, we could be looking at a catastrophic escalation. Those artifacts, especially the mirrors and the flute, are not mere curiosities. They are powerful conduits, possibly anchors for the parasitic entity itself. Blackwood used them in his ritual. They are intrinsically linked to its power. Their energies could be released or amplified, drawing the entity's attention and power to a dangerous degree." "What do we do?" I asked, a fresh wave of panic washing over me. "You must go back, Clara," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Tonight, after the gallery closes, you must retrieve those artifacts, all of them." My stomach lurched. "Professor, I barely made it out with the box. That passage, the chamber, it's deep, it's dark, and now I know what's really down there." The thought of venturing even further into that ancient, malevolent space, deeper into the earth, where the very air felt thick with unseen forces, made my blood run cold. "I understand your fear, Clara. Believe me, I do," he said, his voice softening slightly, but the resolve was still there. "But you are the only one who can do this. You have the knowledge, you have the proximity, and crucially, the entity has already focused its attention on you. In a strange way, that gives you a certain immunity and awareness. You are not a random intruder." "Immunity or target practice," I muttered, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "A little of both, perhaps," he conceded. "But you now have the advantage of knowing its nature, and I have gained some insights from the box. The glyphs on it are indeed a complex binding ritual, but they also contain elements of containment and redirection. If Blackwood truly tried to bind an ancient spirit, he would have needed to control its movements, its emanations. This box, I believe, was intended to be his personal focus, his tether to the entity." "What about the mirrors and the flutes?" I asked, trying to focus on the task ahead to push back the encroaching terror. Those, I suspect, are broader anchors or perhaps components of the ritual meant to amplify the connection between Blackwood and the entity, or even to lure other spirits. The mirrors, especially with their ability to reflect the true self, could be gateways or prisons for aspects of a soul. The flute, a lure, a call to the ethereal. So if I take them out, will it weaken the entity in the painting? That is our hope. By severing its physical anchors, by isolating its power source, we may weaken its hold on the painting and perhaps on Blackwood's tormented soul. It might even force it into a more dormant state, making it easier to neutralize later. But the process itself will be dangerous. When you touch them, you will be interacting directly with their energetic field, with the remnants of Blackwood's ritual, and with the parasitic entity's influence. He paused, and I heard the rustle of papers on his end. Clara, listen carefully. I found some more notes from Croft detailing the safeguarding of these items. He believed they needed to be contained in a specific way to prevent them from bleeding energy. He mentions lining their resting place with a certain type of white clay and a layer of coarse, unrefined iron filings. Iron filings. Yes, iron in many ancient traditions is believed to be a repellent to malevolent spirits, a grounding element. It creates a sort of energetic shield. We won't have time to recreate Croft's entire chamber, but you must bring something to wrap them in that is not just linen. Something with a grounding property, a spiritual insulator. My mind raced. What about aluminum foil or a cast iron pot? Too crude, too cumbersome, and potentially conductive in an unpredictable way with these specific energies. No. Think simpler, more natural, more aligned with the protective rituals. Do you have any natural fibers like wool and perhaps a bag of rock salt or even garden soil? I have a thick wool blanket and a bag of Epsom salts, I offered, remembering supplies I kept for my rare, indulgent baths. Excellent. The Epsom salts will serve as a suitable substitute for coarse rock salt in a pinch, and the wool blanket will provide a good insulating layer. Wrap each artifact individually, Clara, first in your linen, then in the wool, and then as a final layer, create a pouch with the Epsom salts, or simply pour a generous amount into the wool wrapping to create a barrier. Handle them with the thickest gloves you possess. And do not, under any circumstances, allow the mirrors to reflect your face. Keep them face down or wrapped immediately. The warning about the mirrors sent a chill down my spine, reflecting the true self. What dark truths would they reveal, or worse, what would look back from their depths? Professor, what if it's too risky? What if I get trapped down there? My voice was barely a whisper. I will be here, Clara. My phone will be on all night. Call me as soon as you have them or if you encounter any trouble. I will also be focusing on a specific counter-ritual here, drawing on the energies of the binding box to create a temporary ward that might offer you some protection. It's not foolproof, but it's something. But you must be quick, in and out, do not linger. He then gave me a precise set of instructions for navigating the passage based on the camera probe's images and emphasized the need for absolute stealth. No lights that could be seen from outside. Rely on your flashlight, but keep it pointed down, avoid sweeping it wildly. Move silently. The gallery's security system will be your greatest ally, keeping out any mundane intruders, but its silence will also amplify every sound you make. As I hung up, my hands were shaking. The enormity of the task weighed heavily on me. This wasn't just about art history anymore. It was about ancient magic, vengeful spirits, and a desperate race against time. I spent the next few hours meticulously preparing. I went home, gathering my thickest pair of winter gloves, the softest wool blanket I owned, and the bag of Epsom salts. I wrapped my sturdy flashlight in a piece of black cloth to minimize its visible beam, yet still allow light to pass. My phone, fully charged, would be my lifeline, and of course the camera, still ready to document. I changed into dark, comfortable clothes again and tied my hair back tightly. The night outside my apartment window was darker than before, the moon now completely obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. A chill wind howled, rattling the panes, mirroring the tempest in my soul. I imagined Professor Finch, surrounded by his own array of esoteric tools, performing his counter-ritual, a silent partner in this perilous endeavor. This time, the walk to the gallery felt even more laden with dread. The building, a silent monolith against the bruised sky, seemed to vibrate with a latent energy, a hum that was both enticing and terrifying. I unlocked the heavy oak doors, the creak echoing unnervingly in the oppressive silence, and stepped inside. The main hall was plunged into a deeper darkness tonight. Not a single sliver of moonlight pierced the thick clouds, leaving the space in utter, inky blackness. My flashlight, even wrapped, felt like a beacon, its beam cutting a stark path through the void. The air was colder, heavier, and that faint, sweet metallic scent, though still subdued, was definitely present, a subtle reminder of the painting's watchful presence. I didn't even look at the Blackwood portrait this time. I couldn't. I felt its gaze, a prickle on the back of my neck, but I refused to acknowledge it, refused to give it any power. My focus was on the basement door, a dark rectangular void against the wall. Opening the door, I was assaulted by an even stronger blast of that cold, earthy, metallic air. It felt like walking into a maw, into the very breath of the ancient earth. The wooden stairs groaned as I descended, each step a testament to my reckless courage or perhaps my utter foolishness. The basement was a true abyss. The previous day's brief fluorescent flicker was gone, leaving me reliant solely on my carefully shrouded flashlight. The shadows were deeper, more menacing, populated by grotesque shapes conjured by my own terrified imagination. The oppressive feeling was back with a vengeance, thick and suffocating, like a blanket woven from dread. I felt watched not just by the painting above, but by unseen eyes lurking in the forgotten corners of this subterranean world. I moved slowly, deliberately, my every nerve ending screaming. The familiar maze of shelves, the forgotten artifacts, they now seemed imbued with a sinister life, their forms twisting and shifting in the limited light. The metallic scent was growing stronger with every step I took towards the collapsed coal chute, a visceral reminder of the ancient blood that permeated this place. My gloved hands gripped the wool blanket and the bag of Epsom salts I carried, a small comfort against the encroaching fear. I pushed through a curtain of ancient cobwebs, their delicate threads clinging to my hair and clothes, making me shudder. The cold seeped into my bones, a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the very stone around me. Finally, I reached the area of the coal chute. The gaping maw, a dark fissure in the rock face, now seemed even more ominous. This was where the camera probe had gone. This was where the hidden chamber lay. I shone my flashlight into the passage. It was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, and twisted into the earth like a subterranean wormhole. The walls were uneven, rough-hewn stone glistening with dampness, studded with dark, fibrous roots. A palpable sense of ancient stillness hung in the air, a breathless anticipation. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I began my descent. I had to go in feet first, carefully maneuvering my body through the tight opening. The rough stones scraped against my clothes, and the earthy smell was now overwhelming, mixed with that distinctive metallic sweetness. It felt like crawling into a grave. The passage was steeper than it looked, forcing me to lower myself hand over hand, my feet scrambling for purchase on the uneven floor. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides, the limited beam of my flashlight creating an illusion of safety that was constantly threatened by the unseen. I was completely alone, utterly vulnerable. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the passage widened slightly. My flashlight beam danced ahead, revealing a small, crudely carved doorway, partially obscured by rubble and matted roots. This was it, the hidden chamber. As I neared the opening, I felt a distinct shift in the air. It wasn't just cold, it was charged. A subtle hum, a low vibration, seemed to resonate through the stone, making my teeth ache. And then I saw it, the reddish glow, faint but unmistakable, pulsating from within the chamber. It was like a dying ember, a malevolent heart beating in the darkness. Taking another fortifying breath, I squeezed through the opening into the chamber. It was a small, roughly square room, the walls carved from the raw bedrock. In the center, on a crude stone pedestal, bathed in the faint, reddish luminescence, sat the 3 obsidian mirrors and the bone flute. They were exactly as they had appeared on the monitor, but infinitely more unsettling in person. The mirrors, perfectly smooth and polished, absorbed and reflected the reddish glow with a hypnotic quality, their dark surfaces seeming to shimmer with an inner life. I averted my gaze, remembering Professor Finch's warning not to look directly into them. The bone flute lay beside them, its surface intricately carved with symbols that seemed to echo those on the binding box. It looked ancient, almost primordial, its dark, porous texture hinting at untold ages and unknown rituals. The reddish glow, I now realized, seemed to emanate from the mirrors themselves, a subtle internal light that pulsed rhythmically, almost like a slow heartbeat. It was the same energy I'd felt radiating from the binding box, but here it was raw, unfiltered, emanating from the heart of their power. My gloved hands trembled as I reached for the wool blanket and the bag of Epsom salts. This was the moment of truth. I approached the pedestal cautiously, my eyes scanning the chamber. There was nothing else, no other hidden objects, just the stark, raw stone and the pulsating artifacts. I carefully picked up the bone flute first. As my gloved fingers brushed against its ancient surface, a jolt, cold and powerful, shot through my arm. It wasn't just the cold, it was a pure, unadulterated energy, a whisper of ancient voices and forgotten melodies. The metallic scent intensified, making my head swim. I quickly wrapped it in a layer of linen, then a layer of wool, and finally poured a generous amount of Epsom salts into the wrapping before securing it tightly. Even through the layers, I could feel the faint, chilling hum of its power. Next, the obsidian mirrors. There were 3 of them, all roughly the size of my palm, oblong and impossibly dark. They felt dense, heavy, like concentrated darkness. I picked up the first one, carefully avoiding its reflective surface, turning it face down against my palm. The cold was shocking, far more intense than the flute, radiating an almost painful chill. It felt like holding a fragment of solidified night, alive with a strange, malevolent pulse. As my gloved fingers closed around the mirror, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, not with my ears, but directly inside my mind. A cold, echoing presence. "Welcome, Clara, you have come home." My breath hitched. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the mirror, my heart leaping into my throat. The voice was soft, insidious, yet filled with an ancient power that froze me to the core. It was the parasitic spirit. It knew my name. It had been waiting. Professor Finch's words echoed, "Don't engage it directly. Mentally shield yourself." I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to visualize a protective barrier, trying to focus on my mission, on the mundane. Taking another ragged breath, I forced myself to continue. I wrapped the first mirror in linen, then wool, then a generous amount of Epsom salts, securing it tightly. I repeated the process for the second mirror and then the third, each one a terrifying ordeal, each one radiating that piercing cold and the subtle mind whisper. The urge to flee was almost overwhelming, but I pushed through it, fueled by a desperate determination. As I wrapped the last mirror, a wave of intense dizziness washed over me, far stronger than anything I had experienced before. The reddish glow from the pedestal, now devoid of the artifacts, seemed to pulse angrily, flaring brighter for a split second before dying down to a barely visible flicker. The metallic scent in the chamber intensified, acrid and suffocating. I staggered, clutching the wrapped artifacts to my chest, my head spinning violently. The oppressive feeling in the chamber was now unbearable, a crushing weight of unseen malice. It felt like the very air was screaming around me, an ancient, furious howl. I had disturbed something ancient and powerful. I scrambled out of the chamber, almost crawling through the narrow passage, desperate to escape. The raw stones scraped against my skin, the roots catching at my clothes, but I barely registered the pain. My only thought was escape. The ascent back up the coal chute felt infinitely harder than the descent. My limbs ached, my head throbbed, and the oppressive feeling of the basement now seemed to be chasing me, clinging to my very being. The wrapped artifacts felt impossibly heavy in my arms, pulsating with a cold, malevolent energy that seeped through all the protective layers. Finally, I emerged from the coal chute, gasping for breath, collapsing onto the dusty basement floor. The relative openness of the basement, even in its inky darkness, felt like a blessed relief after the suffocating confines of the passage and chamber. I lay there for a moment, chest heaving, trying to gather my strength, trying to quiet the frantic pounding of my heart. The whispering voice in my head had subsided, but its chilling presence still lingered at the edges of my consciousness. Slowly, painfully, I rose, clutching the bundles to my chest. I had to get out. I had to get these to Professor Finch. I began the arduous journey back through the labyrinthine basement, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, every creak of the old building sounding like a malicious whisper. The wrapped artifacts felt like a lead weight in my arms, their cold radiating into my very core. When I finally reached the wooden stairs, I practically stumbled up them, desperate for the sanctuary of the main hall. I pulled the basement door shut behind me, the heavy thud a sound of closure, of temporary victory. I leaned against the door, panting, my entire body trembling. The main hall was still shrouded in moonless darkness, but it felt immeasurably safer than the horrors I had just faced. The air here was lighter, less oppressive, though the faint metallic scent was still there, subtle but persistent. And then I looked at the Blackwood portrait. In the near total darkness, it was difficult to make out details, but I felt a profound shift. The silence around the painting was no longer merely subdued. It was profound, almost reverent, and through the gloom I saw it. The face was no longer stern or merely triumphant. It was contorted, caught in a tableau of pure, unadulterated agony. The lines around his eyes were deepened into chasms of torment, his mouth open in a silent scream, his skin stretched taut, gray, almost translucent. And from the corner of one eye, a single, perfectly formed tear, glistening wetly even in the darkness, seemed to hang poised, forever falling. The removal of the artifacts, their anchors, had not made the parasitic entity dormant. It had unleashed something else. It had amplified Blackwood's suffering, tearing at his soul, exposing his agony for all to see. Or perhaps the parasitic entity was simply showing its true face, revealing its torture of Blackwood more vividly now that its other avenues of influence were severed. A fresh wave of nausea washed over me, colder and more profound than any I had experienced. This wasn't victory, this was a deeper plunge into the heart of the horror. I had merely traded one form of terror for another. I quickly made my way to the main entrance, disarmed the alarm, and slipped out into the night, clutching the bundled artifacts tightly to my chest. The cold night air felt like a balm on my feverish skin, but it did little to quell the turmoil in my mind. The image of Blackwood's screaming, weeping face was seared into my brain, and the insidious whisper, "Welcome, Clara, you have come home," echoed in my skull. The walk to the Oakhaven Inn was a blur. My body was on autopilot, propelled by a desperate urgency. I knocked on Professor Finch's door, my knuckles white. He opened it immediately, as if he had been waiting right behind it. His eyes, usually hidden behind his spectacles, were wide and piercing, scanning me, then the bundles in my arms. "You have them?" he whispered, pulling me inside. His room was a chaotic mess of books and papers, the salt circle around the binding box still intact, the beeswax candle still flickering, but he seemed oblivious to it all. He cleared a space on his small table, carefully laying down a fresh piece of velvet cloth. I gently placed the wrapped bundles onto the cloth. Even through the wool and linen, their cold radiated, a chilling testament to the power they contained. "Professor, I heard it," I stammered, my voice trembling. "The entity, it spoke to me. It said, 'Welcome, Clara, you have come home.'" Professor Finch froze, his face paling visibly. He looked at me with a new, profound gravity. "It spoke to you directly, not just an impression, but words." I nodded, unable to speak, the memory of the cold whisper chilling me to the bone. He ran a hand through his wild hair, his brow deeply furrowed. "That changes things, significantly. It means its focus on you is even stronger than I anticipated. It's attempting to establish a deeper connection, to claim you. It sees you as a potential vessel or perhaps a permanent, vital link." He carefully, cautiously began to unwrap the bundles, using silver tongs similar to those he used on the binding box. The first was the bone flute. As the wool and linen fell away, the intricate carvings seemed to writhe, and a faint, mournful sound, like a distant echo, seemed to emanate from its ancient form. "This, Clara," he said, his voice hushed with awe, "is far more powerful than I imagined. This is not just a lure, it's a conduit for direct spiritual communication, perhaps even possession." Blackwood, in his arrogance, was playing with fire. Next, the obsidian mirrors. As he unwrapped them one by one, their dark surfaces, polished to an impossible sheen, seemed to drink the lamplight. He immediately placed them face down on the velvet cloth, not allowing his own reflection to fall upon their depths. "These," he breathed, "are truly dangerous. Mirrors in the occult are gateways. These, I believe, were intended to bridge the gap between worlds, to draw forth specific entities, or even to fragment Blackwood's own soul and trap aspects of it within them, allowing him to exist in multiple places. He examined their back surfaces, tracing the faint, almost invisible etchings with his gloved finger. More glyphs, very similar to the binding box, but with additional symbols I recognize from ancient Egyptian funerary rites and some obscure South American death cults. A truly eclectic and volatile combination. He then performed a similar containment ritual as he had with the binding box, applying clear liquid to the glyphs, muttering incantations, and then encircling them with fresh sea salt and placing more beeswax candles around them. The room began to feel less oppressive, the immediate chill from the artifacts slowly receding, but the lingering presence of their power remained. "The good news," Professor Finch said, finally looking up, a flicker of hope in his eyes, "is that you successfully retrieved them. This is a monumental step, Clara. We have now severed the primary physical anchors of the entity. Its ability to project its influence, its power to manifest, should be significantly diminished. This should give us a critical window." "But the painting, Professor," I interrupted, recounting the vision of Blackwood's agony. His face, it was screaming. He was weeping. It wasn't dormant, it was amplified, like his torment was laid bare. Professor Finch nodded slowly, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. "That aligns with my hypothesis. With the physical anchors removed, the entity's direct connection to its broader network of power is severed. This may force it to retreat, to focus its remaining energy on its immediate host, Blackwood's trapped soul. This would indeed manifest as intensified torment, as the parasitic entity, now confined, continues its internal feeding." "So Blackwood is suffering more because of what I did?" I asked, a wave of guilt washing over me. "Perhaps, but you also brought him closer to a potential release, Clara," Professor Finch countered gently. "By isolating the entity, by containing its anchors, we have narrowed its sphere of influence. We have made it vulnerable. It is no longer a sprawling, diffuse presence. It is now primarily confined to the painting, feeding directly on Blackwood. This means our next step becomes clearer, to directly confront the entity within the painting." My blood ran cold. "Confront it, how?" "With this," he said, gesturing to the binding box, now dormant within its salt circle. "And these," he added, indicating the newly contained mirrors and flute. The binding box, as I've discovered from Croft's notes, contains a series of reverse glyphs, a kind of unbinding spell. Blackwood designed it to bind, but also paradoxically to release what was bound should he choose. He created his own cage with his own key. The problem is, he never learned to use the key properly. And the mirrors and the flute. These, I believe, can serve two purposes. The mirrors, if properly cleansed and activated with a specific counter-ritual, can be used to reflect not just an image, but the true essence of a spirit, forcing it to reveal its form. And the flute, if played with the correct intention, with specific counter-melodies, can act as a repellent, a spiritual dissonant, driving away unwanted ethereal presences. "You want me to play a bone flute at the painting?" I asked, a sense of surreal absurdity mixing with my terror. He managed a small, tired smile. "Not you, Clara, not yet. I will, but this ritual will be complex. It requires precise timing, specific environmental conditions, and a substantial amount of focused energy. We need to prepare." "What kind of preparation?" "First, we need to cleanse the gallery," he explained, his gaze distant, as if already envisioning the task. "The residual energy from the entity is still potent. We need to create an environment hostile to it, an anathema. This involves specific incense, purifying waters, and the symbolic use of light and sound. Then we need to set up a containment circle around the painting itself, using the same principles of iron and salt that Croft hinted at, but on a larger scale. This will prevent the entity from escaping the painting when we attempt to unbind it or force it out. And when do we do all this? As soon as possible, tomorrow if we can, while the entity is still reeling from the removal of its anchors, while its power is at its most contained. We must strike while the iron is while the spiritual energy is at its most vulnerable. But first, Clara, you must get some rest, a proper, deep sleep. You have faced down true darkness tonight, and you will need all your strength for what comes next. He offered me a small, calming herbal tea, which I gratefully accepted. The warmth spread through my chilled body, and the gentle scent of lavender and chamomile began to soothe my frayed nerves. "Professor," I asked, my voice barely a whisper, "what if it doesn't work? What if this entity is too powerful?" He looked at me, his eyes grave but resolute. "Then we will have done everything in our power, but I believe it will work. Blackwood was a dabbler, Clara. He was arrogant, but ultimately limited in his understanding. He created a cage, yes, but he also left behind the tools for its undoing, and we have now collected them all." I finally felt a semblance of exhaustion wash over me. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the night began to recede, leaving me drained. He led me to a small, unused cot in his room, assuring me he would watch over the artifacts. "Rest, Clara, you've earned it, and we have a long, difficult day ahead." I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first truly peaceful slumber I'd had in what felt like weeks. When I awoke, the morning sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the cluttered room. Professor Finch was already awake, hunched over his notes, his face intent. The artifacts sat silently on their velvet cloths, their power still but ever present. I felt surprisingly refreshed, a new resolve hardening my spirit. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now tempered by a fierce determination. I had faced the monster in the dark and emerged. I had collected the tools for its defeat. Now it was time to finish this. After a quick breakfast of stale muffins and strong coffee, Professor Finch began to outline the plan for the day. First, the cleansing. We need to clear the lingering malevolent energy from the main hall. I have a blend of sacred herbs, frankincense, myrrh, and cedar, which we will burn as incense. We'll also use purified water infused with sea salt to sprinkle along the perimeter of the hall. This will create a spiritual barrier, making the space less hospitable to the entity. Then the containment circle. Around the Blackwood portrait, we will lay a line of rock salt infused with crushed iron filings. Croft hinted at the use of iron. It's a powerful repellent against certain ethereal entities. This circle will act as a secondary barrier, containing the entity within the painting when we begin the unbinding ritual. Finally, we prepare for the unbinding. This will be the most critical and dangerous part. It requires absolute concentration and precision. I will stand before the painting. You, Clara, will be my assistant. Your role will be crucial, monitoring the painting, relaying any changes you observe, and assisting with the placement of the artifacts as I direct. He then laid out the tools he would need: a small brass censer for the incense, a silver bowl for the purified water, a pouch of rock salt mixed with iron filings, and a small, intricately carved wooden wand. He also had a small, ancient leather-bound book, its pages filled with elegant, arcane script, presumably the ancient methods he had mentioned. The time of day is also critical, he explained. Ancient texts suggest that twilight, the liminal hour between day and night, is when the veil between worlds is thinnest. That is when the entity's power will be most accessible and paradoxically most vulnerable. We will begin the ritual just as the sun begins to set. The thought of facing the painting in the deepening gloom of twilight sent a shiver down my spine. We left the inn, the contained artifacts secured in Professor Finch's car, and made our way to the gallery. The building seemed to hum with a nervous energy, a silent anticipation. Mrs. Gable was already there, bustling about, completely unaware of the ancient drama about to unfold within her walls. "Good morning, Professor Clara," she chirped, oblivious. "Everything all right? I thought I heard some unusual sounds last night, but I'm probably just getting old." She gave me a suspicious glance. "Clara, you look a bit pale. Long night." "Just a touch of a head cold, Mrs. Gable," I lied smoothly, forcing a smile. "And yes, the gallery can be noisy at night with the old pipes. Professor Finch and I are just getting ready to review some colonial inventory." Professor Finch nodded sagely. "Indeed, Mrs. Gable, will be in the main hall, just a bit of a thorough inspection." We quickly secured the main hall, placing a "Do Not Disturb Inventory in Progress" sign on the entrance. I switched on my camera, aiming it squarely at the Blackwood portrait, its red recording light a tiny, reassuring beacon. The painting still displayed the face of agony, the silent scream, the weeping tear. It was a stark, chilling sight, and it confirmed Professor Finch's assessment. Blackwood was in torment. Professor Finch began the cleansing ritual. He lit the incense in the censer, and a thick plume of fragrant smoke, sweet and earthy, filled the air, dispelling the lingering metallic odor. He moved slowly around the perimeter of the main hall, chanting softly in a language I didn't recognize, the smoke curling and swirling around him. As he moved, he sprinkled the purified water from the silver bowl, its droplets glittering like liquid diamonds in the morning light. I watched, mesmerized, as the atmosphere in the hall began to change. The oppressive feeling that had permeated the space slowly receded, replaced by a sense of quiet calm, almost sanctity. It was as if the very air was being scrubbed clean, the ancient malevolence pushed back, contained. After the cleansing, we laid the containment circle. Professor Finch meticulously poured a thin, unbroken line of rock salt and iron filings around the base of the Blackwood portrait, creating a precise, impenetrable barrier. As the salt and iron dust fell, I felt a faint tremor in the air, a subtle resistance, as if something unseen was recoiling from the boundary. The reddish glow I had seen in the hidden chamber, now contained within the painting, seemed to dim even further. The rest of the day was spent in tense anticipation. We retired to a secluded office, reviewing Professor Finch's notes, double-checking the steps of the unbinding ritual. He explained the precise incantations, the order of artifact placement, the specific moments for action. My role was to observe the painting, calling out any changes in Blackwood's expression or any other phenomena, to ensure Professor Finch could react accordingly. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a palpable tension settled over the gallery. The quiet hum of the building seemed to intensify, the air growing thick with unspoken energy. I could feel the painting, even from a distance, pulsing with. We returned to the main hall as the final rays of sunlight bled from the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the polished floors. The air, though cleansed, still crackled with an underlying tension. The Blackwood portrait, illuminated by the last vestiges of natural light, remained fixed in its silent scream, the glistening tear on its cheek a chilling highlight. The rock salt and iron filings formed an unbroken barrier around its base, a stark white line against the dark wood of the floor. Professor Finch, now dressed in a dark, simple robe that looked more ceremonial than scholarly, took his position before the painting. The binding box rested on a small, portable altar he had set up, flanked by the 3 obsidian mirrors and the bone flute, all carefully unwrapped from their protective layers and placed face down on fresh velvet cloths. A single, thick beeswax candle flickered at each corner of the altar, casting dancing shadows. His ancient leather-bound book lay open, its pages filled with meticulous script, next to a small, silver vial of clear liquid and a brush. I stood a few feet behind him, my camera clutched tightly, its red light already glowing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the deepening quiet. Every nerve ending was on edge, anticipating the horror to come. The thought of the entity's chilling whisper, "Welcome, Clara, you have come home," still echoed in my mind. Professor Finch turned to me, his eyes serious behind his spectacles. "Remember your role, Clara, absolute focus. Observe every change, every subtle shift in the painting. Speak clearly and concisely. Do not allow your mind to wander, no matter what you may perceive. This ritual requires a strong anchor in reality." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep, calming breath, then reopened them, his gaze now fixed on the Blackwood portrait with an unwavering intensity. The first hint of twilight had arrived, painting the gallery windows in shades of bruised purple and gray. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint crackle of the beeswax candles and the distant, almost imperceptible hum that now seemed to emanate directly from the painting itself. Professor Finch began. His voice, usually academic and measured, now resonated with a deep, sonorous quality, chanting in the same arcane language he had used during the cleansing. The words were guttural, ancient, filling the air with a strange, compelling rhythm. As he chanted, he traced the glyphs on the binding box with his finger, the dark wood seeming to absorb the sound, growing subtly darker, almost pulsating with the energy of his voice. The painting responded almost immediately. The agonizing expression on Blackwood's face seemed to intensify. The silent scream widened, the tear thickened, and the skin, already gray, seemed to deepen to a sickly pallor like a corpse in rapid decay. "Professor, the face," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "It's worse, more agony." He acknowledged my words with a slight nod, never breaking his chant, never taking his eyes from the portrait. He opened the silver vial and with the small brush began to carefully apply the clear liquid to the glyphs on the binding box. As the liquid touched the ancient carvings, they seemed to glow with a faint inner light, a pale blue luminescence that pulsed in sync with his chanting. The hum from the painting intensified, becoming a low thrum that vibrated through the floorboards up into my feet. It was no longer just a sound, it was a physical sensation, a pressure in my chest. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with a cold, unseen presence. The metallic scent, which had been subdued by the incense, began to return, sharp and coppery, a taste of ancient blood on my tongue. And then the shifts began. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen and writhe at the edges of my vision. From the corner of my eye, I caught glimpses of movement, fleeting forms twisting in the gloom, gaunt, elongated figures that seemed to stretch from the corners of the hall, beckoning, whispering. But Professor Finch's words echoed in my mind. "Do not allow your mind to wander." I forced myself to focus on the painting, my camera lens a tunnel vision. The agony on Blackwood's face deepened further. His eyes, already wide with terror, now seemed to bulge, their pupils dilating into bottomless pits. His mouth opened even wider, stretching unnaturally as if trying to tear itself from his face. The skin around his neck seemed to constrict, pulled taut by an invisible noose. But it wasn't just Blackwood. Within the painted contours of his face, a subtle, grotesque shift began. Beneath the layers of suffering, a faint, almost transparent second face began to emerge, superimposed on Blackwood's. It was skeletal, predatory, with sharp, needle-like teeth and eyes that burned with a cold, malevolent light. The parasitic spirit was revealing itself. Professor, I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. There's another face within his. It's the entity. Professor Finch's chant grew stronger, his voice rising in volume, pushing against the encroaching darkness. He finished applying the liquid to the glyphs, and the entire binding box now pulsed with a steady blue light, radiating a faint warmth that seemed to push back against the gallery's oppressive chill. He then carefully picked up the bone flute. Its ancient surface, intricately carved, seemed to hum in his hand. He raised it to his lips, and for a moment I thought he would play it. But instead he merely held it there, pointing it directly at the painting, continuing his rhythmic chant, now infused with a new, urgent cadence. The flute seemed to absorb the sounds of his words, vibrating faintly. As he aimed the flute, the entity's face in the painting reacted violently. The skeletal features contorted in a silent snarl, its eyes burning brighter, twin points of pure malice. The pressure in the room intensified, threatening to crush me. The whispers from the shadows grew louder, more insistent, weaving chilling threats and desperate pleas into my mind. Release us, join us, you belong here, Clara. I squeezed my eyes shut for a split second, shaking my head violently, trying to clear the invading voices. I focused on Professor Finch, on the steady rhythm of his chant, on the flickering candles, on the rock-salt circle around the painting. Anchor in reality. He finished the current section of his chant, then lowered the flute slightly. Clara, he commanded, his voice strained but clear, the first mirror. Place it on the altar, face up, directly reflecting the painting. My hands shook as I reached for the first obsidian mirror. I tried to remember his warning about my reflection, but he now wanted it face up. Was it safe? I trusted him. I carefully picked up the mirror, its cold radiating even through my gloves. I positioned it on the altar, its impossibly dark surface catching the flickering candlelight, and then slowly angled it until the Blackwood portrait was perfectly reflected within its depths. As the reflection of the painting settled into the mirror, a chilling phenomenon occurred. The reddish glow I had seen in the hidden chamber, now contained within the painting, intensified dramatically. It pulsed and flared, and from the surface of the mirror, the two faces, Blackwood's agony and the entity's malice, seemed to ripple and distort, as if caught in a liquid nightmare. The entity's skeletal face now seemed to shimmer, separating slightly from Blackwood's, becoming a distinct, horrifying image trapped within the mirror's dark pool. It is revealing itself, Professor Finch murmured, his voice laced with a mixture of apprehension and triumph. The mirror draws its true form. Now, Clara, the incantation, repeat after me clearly and with full intent. He began to recite a new set of words, different from the previous chants. These were shorter, sharper, imbued with an undeniable authority. They felt like commands. I struggled to repeat them, my voice cracking at first, but then gaining strength as I focused, pouring all my will into each syllable. The words felt ancient on my tongue, powerful, resonating deep within my bones. As we spoke the incantation, the entity in the mirror thrashed, its reflected form twisting and writhing. The whispers in my mind became a shriek, a cacophony of distorted voices, threatening pure agony. The pressure in the room became unbearable, like being squeezed by an unseen giant. Dust motes danced in the candlelight, swirling like angry phantoms. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind swept through the hall, though all the doors and windows were closed. The candles flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish. A cold, guttural laugh, not from any human throat, echoed from the painting itself, a sound that seemed to scrape against my very soul. The rock salt and iron filings around the painting seemed to spark, tiny flashes of light illuminating the barrier as the entity tried to push against it. Professor Finch, unperturbed, continued his part of the incantation, his voice a rock in the storm. Clara, the second mirror, now. I grabbed the second mirror, placing it beside the first, angling it to also reflect the painting. This time the effect was even more dramatic. The entity's face in the first mirror solidified, becoming clearer, sharper, more defined in its skeletal horror. And as the second mirror took its reflection, the entity seemed to multiply within the two dark surfaces, its image shimmering between them, creating a maddening, kaleidoscopic effect of pure malice. The whispers became a roar, assaulting my mind, threatening to shatter my sanity. You cannot contain me. I am eternal. I am Legion. Blackwood's face in the painting, however, seemed to change subtly. The screaming agony remained, but the transparency of the parasitic entity overlaying it seemed to thin, to weaken, as if parts of it were being drawn into the mirrors. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound of profound relief, seemed to emanate from the portrait, quickly swallowed by the entity's rage. "It is weakening," Professor Finch cried, his voice triumphant. "Keep reciting the incantation, Clara. We are drawing it out." I redoubled my efforts, shouting the ancient words through the terrifying din. My head throbbed, my body felt like it was on fire, but I pushed through, driven by a desperate hope. The third mirror, Clara, the final anchor. I reached for the last mirror. As my gloved hand touched its surface, a burst of icy cold shot through me, far more intense than before. This mirror felt different. It hummed with a primal energy, a raw, untamed power. I carefully placed it, angling it to complete the reflection. The moment the third mirror caught the painting's image, the entire main hall exploded with energy. The reddish glow from the painting became blinding, flaring outwards, momentarily extinguishing the candlelight. A deafening shriek, raw and full of ancient fury, tore through the air, vibrating in my bones, making my teeth ache. The very walls of the gallery seemed to groan, and I felt the floor tremble beneath my feet. The three mirrors now acted as a unified gateway, reflecting and amplifying each other. The parasitic entity's true form, no longer a mere overlay, seemed to materialize within the mirror's depths. It was a swirling vortex of shadow and skeletal fragments, its eyes burning with pure, concentrated hatred. It was no longer just an image. It felt like a tangible presence, thrashing within the mirror prison, trying to claw its way out. And as the entity's presence solidified in the mirrors, Blackwood's face in the painting underwent its most dramatic transformation yet. The grotesque features of the parasitic entity receded entirely. What was left was Blackwood, still agonized, still screaming, still weeping, but now alone. His skin, though still pallid, no longer bore the marks of decay. The eyes, though wide with terror, were his own, filled with an ancient, profound sorrow. The screaming was no longer silent. A faint, almost inaudible wail seemed to emanate from the portrait, a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering, but also, paradoxically, of liberation. "He is free of it," Professor Finch roared, his voice barely audible above the entity's shriek. "The entity is contained. Now, Clara, the flute, quick." I grabbed the bone flute, its surface warm and vibrating with a strange energy. I handed it to Professor Finch. He took it, and with a swift, decisive motion, he raised it to his lips. This time he didn't chant, he played. The first note that emanated from the ancient bone flute was not a melody, but a discordant wail, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the entity's shriek like a knife. It was a sound that seemed to twist the very fabric of the air, a spiritual dissonant that grated against every nerve ending. The sound was not beautiful, it was pure, concentrated expulsion. As Professor Finch played, his fingers dancing over the carved holes with a surprising agility, the entity trapped in the mirrors recoiled violently. Its swirling, shadowy form seemed to contract, shrinking away from the piercing notes, its shrieks becoming fractured, desperate. The reddish glow from the mirrors pulsed erratically, dimming, then flaring as if struggling against an unbearable force. The unholy din in the hall was deafening. The entity's broken shrieks mingled with the piercing wail of the flute, creating a cacophony of spiritual warfare. The air grew frigid, then searing hot, then frigid again, as if the very elements were tearing themselves apart. I felt dizzy, disoriented, my body trembling uncontrollably. I gripped my camera, forcing myself to stand, to observe, to be the anchor Professor Finch needed. Blackwood's face in the painting, however, seemed to find a strange peace amidst the chaos. The silent scream lessened, though the tear still fell. His eyes, though still terrified, seemed to hold a glimmer of comprehension, a flicker of something akin to gratitude. His suffering, though still immense, was now his own, unmarred by the parasitic tormentor. Professor Finch played on, his face contorted with effort, sweat beading on his brow. The notes from the flute were relentless, a continuous wave of spiritual repulsion. The entity in the mirrors began to dim, its shadowy form shrinking, becoming less defined, less substantial. The reddish glow faded, turning gray, then black, as if its very essence was being consumed by the flute's sound. And then, with a final, piercing blast from the flute, the entity in the mirrors vanished. It didn't explode or dissipate in a flash of light. It simply ceased to be. The three obsidian mirrors, now reflecting only the flickering candlelight and the agonized face of Blackwood, became inert, their dark surfaces devoid of the terrifying presence that had pulsed within them moments before. The reddish glow was gone. The cold metallic scent evaporated, replaced by the lingering sweetness of the incense. The deafening shriek ceased. The oppressive pressure lifted. Silence. A profound, absolute silence descended upon the main hall. The only sounds were the crackling of the beeswax candles, the ragged breathing of Professor Finch, and the frantic pounding of my own heart. Professor Finch slowly lowered the bone flute, his arm trembling. He looked utterly drained, his face pale and streaked with sweat, but his eyes held a profound sense of accomplishment. I stared at the mirrors, then at the painting. The mirrors were just mirrors again, dark and reflective, but no longer sinister, and the Blackwood portrait. The screaming agony was gone. The tear, though still visible, no longer seemed to fall. Blackwood's face, though still pallid and etched with lines of profound weariness, was no longer contorted in terror. His mouth was closed, his eyes, though haunted, now held a deep, melancholic sorrow. It was the face of a man who had endured unimaginable suffering, a man trapped, yes, but now finally at peace in his torment. The malevolent grin, the triumphant sneer of the parasitic entity, all of it was gone. "He is free," Professor Finch whispered, his voice hoarse, a hint of awe in his tone. "Free from its parasitic hold. The entity has been banished, or perhaps utterly destroyed." A wave of exhaustion, so profound it threatened to buckle my knees, washed over me. The adrenaline that had fueled me for hours completely drained away, leaving me weak and trembling. I leaned against a nearby display case, struggling to remain standing. "What now, Professor?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Is it over?" Professor Finch took a moment to compose himself, regathering his strength. He carefully placed the bone flute back on the altar, then picked up the silver tongs. With meticulous care, he began to turn the obsidian mirrors face down, muttering a final, quiet incantation as he did so, as if sealing away their power. He then replaced the lids on the binding box, extinguishing the blue glow. "It is not entirely over, Clara," he said, finally turning to face me, a tired smile gracing his lips. "But the immediate danger has passed. The parasitic entity, the source of the painting's malevolence, has been dealt with. Blackwood's soul is no longer being actively devoured. He is still trapped, yes, but now he exists in a state of stasis, of profound regret and sorrow, but without the active, ongoing torture of the entity." He walked over to the painting, stepping carefully over the rock-salt circle, and gazed at Blackwood's portrait. "He is what he made himself to be, an eternal prisoner of his own creation. His arrogance, his hubris, confined him to this painted purgatory. But now he can perhaps finally find some measure of repose. He is no longer a threat." "What about the painting itself?" I asked, looking at Blackwood's sorrowful, haunted eyes. "Will it still change?" "No," Professor Finch affirmed, shaking his head. "Without the parasitic entity to fuel its malevolent shifts, without its ability to feed and project its influence, the painting will revert to a static image. It may retain this expression of remorse, or it may slowly revert to its original stern likeness over time. But it will no longer be a living, breathing conduit of terror. It will simply be a painting." A painting. The words felt utterly mundane after the nightmare we had just faced. "And the artifacts?" I asked, gesturing to the altar. "These," Professor Finch said, carefully wrapping the mirrors and the flute in their protective layers of wool and linen, "will need to be secured permanently. I will take them back to Oakhaven, where I have a secure, warded vault. They must never again be used or fall into the wrong hands. The binding box, too, will be sealed and kept under my personal protection. These are dangerous tools, Clara, reminders of the folly of man's ambition." He extinguished the beeswax candles, plunging the altar into deeper shadow. The air now felt strangely empty, lighter, almost buoyant. The heavy weight of unseen forces had truly lifted. "We did it, Professor," I whispered, a surge of profound relief washing over me, bringing tears to my eyes. "We did it, Clara," he agreed, his own voice thick with emotion. He reached out and placed a gentle, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You were incredibly brave. You faced down forces that would break most people. Your quick thinking, your unwavering focus, your willingness to put yourself in harm's way, you were instrumental in this victory." I felt a blush creep up my neck. I was no hero. I was simply terrified, but I had persevered. "I just wanted it to stop," I confessed, "to make sense of it all." "And you have," he said. "You have brought sense to a terrifying enigma. You have brought peace to a tormented soul and banished a malevolent entity. That is no small feat, Clara, no small feat at all." We spent the next hour meticulously cleaning up. Professor Finch carefully swept up every grain of rock salt and iron filings, explaining that every trace of the ritual must be removed to ensure no lingering energetic imprints remained. I helped him dismantle the temporary altar, carefully wrapping the now inert artifacts, feeling only a lingering coldness, not the chilling hum of power. As we finished, the first hint of dawn began to paint the sky, a soft, pale gray replacing the inky blackness. The gallery, which had been a battleground of ancient forces just hours before, now stood silent, serene, bathed in the gentle light of a new day. The Blackwood portrait hung on the wall, a portrait of a sad, exhausted man, no longer a gateway to terror. Mrs. Gable arrived punctually at 8 a.m., bustling in with her usual energy. "Morning, Professor, Clara, everything all right? You both look like you've seen a ghost," she exclaimed, eyeing our tired, disheveled appearances. Professor Finch, ever the master of composure, chuckled. "Just a long night, Mrs. Gable. A very thorough inventory review indeed. Found a few discrepancies in the colonial records, nothing major, but we've put everything in order." He gave me a subtle wink. "And Clara here," he continued, placing a hand on my shoulder, "was an invaluable assistant. Her organizational skills are truly exceptional." Mrs. Gable, though still a little suspicious, seemed mollified by the compliments. "Well, that's good to hear. You two get yourselves some rest now. I'll open up." As we left the gallery, the morning sun casting golden rays across the street, a profound sense of closure settled over me. The weight that had been pressing on my soul for weeks, for months, finally lifted. The chilling whispers, the unsettling shifts in the painting, the suffocating presence, it was all gone. "I'll take these artifacts back to Oakhaven now, Clara," Professor Finch said, patting the trunk of his car where the wrapped bundles lay. "I'll ensure they are safely secured. I will also be writing a comprehensive report on Blackwood's ritual and the entity, a document that will be archived for future scholars, but only those with the appropriate clearance and understanding." "Thank you, Professor," I said, looking at him, a deep sense of gratitude filling me. "For everything. You saved me, you saved Blackwood, and you saved the gallery." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "You played your part magnificently, Clara, never doubt that. You are more resilient, more courageous than you give yourself credit for." He paused, his gaze softening. "What will you do now, Clara, with the gallery, with your work?" I looked back at the imposing facade of the gallery, no longer a place of dread, but a place of history, of quiet beauty. "I think I'll stay," I replied, a surprising sense of contentment in my voice. "It's a beautiful building, and now it's finally at peace. I want to be here to witness its new chapter, and Blackwood's in his own way." "A fitting decision," Professor Finch nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "And perhaps, in time, you can even write your own account of these events, a warning, perhaps, for those who might dabble where they shouldn't." We parted ways then, Professor Finch heading back to Oakhaven with his dangerous cargo, and I heading home for the deep, undisturbed sleep I desperately craved. The next few days felt surreal. The gallery was quiet, tranquil. The cold drafts in the basement had vanished, the air now simply cool and earthy. The HVAC team found no further issues when they conducted their exploratory visit to the subterranean passage, finding only an empty, crudely carved chamber, devoid of any strange artifacts or lingering energies. Frank, the lead technician, merely shrugged, attributing the reddish glow on the initial probe to some weird mineral deposit reflecting the camera light, or maybe just a glitch. They sealed off the passage, declaring it an ancient, unstable anomaly best left undisturbed. And the Blackwood portrait, it hung in the main hall, a silent, poignant testament to the horrors it had once contained. Its face remained in that state of profound sorrow, a man trapped in an endless contemplation of his own folly. But it no longer pulsed with malice, no longer shifted with unseen eyes. It was still a painting. A very old, very sad, very well-painted portrait, but just a portrait. The metallic scent was gone, the whispers were gone, the chilling dread was gone. The gallery had been restored, cleansed, returned to its intended purpose as a sanctuary of art and history, not a battleground for ancient evils. I could walk through its halls without fear, without the constant prickle of unseen eyes. I could look at the portrait and feel only a deep empathy for the man trapped within, rather than terror at the entity that had once tormented him. My own life, too, settled into a new rhythm. The insomnia vanished, replaced by peaceful, dreamless sleep. My anxiety, a constant companion for months, receded. I felt lighter, clearer, as if a great weight had been lifted from my own soul. The experience had changed me, of course. I saw the world with new eyes, a profound awareness of the hidden currents, the unseen forces that might exist beneath the surface of the mundane. But it no longer filled me with fear. It filled me with a cautious respect, a deeper understanding of the world's ancient mysteries. Weeks turned into months. Professor Finch continued to correspond, sharing updates on his research into the binding box and the containment of the artifacts. He eventually published a heavily redacted esoteric paper on the energetic manifestations of anthropomorphic spirit trapping, carefully omitting any details that might lead an untrained eye to Blackwood's methods, but hinting at the dangers of hybrid rituals. Life at the gallery was calm, predictable. Mrs. Gable eventually retired, handing over the reins to a new, younger director who was eager to revitalize the museum. I was promoted to assistant curator, my knowledge of the building and its history proving invaluable. I still maintained a certain quiet reserve, a private knowledge of the events that had transpired within these walls. One blustery autumn afternoon, a year after the unbinding ritual, I was dusting the colonial exhibit, a sense of quiet contentment settling over me. The gallery was empty, the sounds of the wind rattling the windows the only companion. I glanced at the Blackwood portrait, still fixed in its expression of melancholic regret. A profound sense of peace emanated from it now, a silent testament to its liberation from the parasitic entity. As I turned to leave the main hall, a faint, almost imperceptible sound caught my ear. It wasn't a whisper or a shriek or the mournful wail of the flute. It was a single, soft, low note, almost like a hum, lingering in the air for a bare second before fading into silence. It was the sound of a voice, a breath, a memory, a sound of profound, exhausted relief. It seemed to emanate not from the painting itself, but from deep within the fabric of the building, a final, lingering echo of Blackwood's tormented, but now, finally, resting soul. It was a final farewell, a quiet thank you. I smiled then, a genuine, unburdened smile. Blackwood was truly at peace. His story, the horror and the redemption, was finally complete. The gallery was truly safe, and I, Clara, the humble assistant curator, had played my part in its and his salvation. The terror was gone, the mystery was solved, the tale was. But then a different sound, not from the painting, not from the building, from outside. A sharp, insistent ringing, the gallery's main telephone. I walked to the reception desk, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly too quiet hall. As I picked up the receiver, a cold knot began to form in my stomach. A sense of unease, unfamiliar and unwelcome, began to creep over me. It wasn't the old dread, but a new, different kind of chill. "Good afternoons, Blackwood Gallery," I answered, my voice professional, but with an underlying tremor I couldn't quite control. "Clara," a voice on the other end said, familiar, but now laced with an unexpected urgency. It was Professor Finch. "Clara, I need you to listen very carefully. I've made a discovery, something unexpected. About the entity, it seems it wasn't destroyed, not entirely." My breath hitched. The old terror, like a coiled snake, began to stir in the pit of my stomach. "What do you mean, Professor?" I whispered, my gaze unconsciously drawn back to the now peaceful Blackwood portrait, a shiver running down my spine. The binding box, he continued, his voice tight. I've been studying it more closely. The glyphs. There's a sequence, a hidden section I didn't interpret correctly before. It wasn't just a container, Clara. It was also a spiritual redirector. When we banished the entity, it didn't just vanish. It was sent somewhere else, redirected through the box. And I believe I've pinpointed its current location. My heart pounded a frantic drum against my ribs. Where, Professor, where was it sent? There was a pause on the line, a long, pregnant silence that stretched taut with unspoken dread. When Professor Finch finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, imbued with a fresh, profound horror. It was sent, Clara, to another vessel, one already present, one intimately familiar with the rituals, Croft's final, desperate act of self-preservation, perhaps. He created a safeguard not just for the artifacts, but for himself. He created a way to ensure the entity, if ever banished, would never seek him out. He built an insurance policy, a new prison in case the old one failed. What are you saying, Professor? I pressed, a cold premonition gripping my soul. I'm saying, Clara, he said, his voice grim, that the entity is now contained within another object, in another place, bound by the very same magic. An object that has been under my very nose this entire time, but I dismissed it as merely an obscure protective charm. It's the silver amulet, Clara, the one I showed you, the one Croft acquired after Blackwood's death. My blood ran cold. The silver amulet, the one Professor Finch had picked up, the one he had kept, the one that was currently with him. Professor, I said, my voice barely audible, where are you now, and where is the amulet? I'm at my study in Oakhaven, he replied, his voice strained. And the amulet, I'm wearing it. I've been wearing it, Clara, ever since you brought me the binding box. As a protective charm, I thought, but it's not a charm, it's a prison, and the entity, it's awake. A sudden, violent tremor shook the gallery, rattling the windows, making the floorboards groan. It wasn't an earthquake. It felt like a ripple of pure, concentrated malevolence. Then from the phone, a new sound, not Professor Finch's voice. A low, guttural growl full of ancient malice emanating from the receiver itself, distorting his voice as if it was being forced through a different, monstrous throat. Clara, Professor Finch's voice was now a mere gasp, choked, strangled. It's trying to escape its feeding. The line went dead. The growl was replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, my hand trembling violently. The silence in the gallery was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, imbued with a chilling dread that dwarfed even the old terror. The entity was not gone, it was just elsewhere, and it had found a new host, a new vessel, and that vessel was Professor Finch. My gaze snapped back to the Blackwood portrait. His face, still sorrowful, still etched with profound regret, seemed to shimmer in the deepening twilight. But it wasn't malevolence. It was a warning, a silent, ancient lament for a new victim. The story was not over, it had simply shifted. And now the hunt for the parasitic entity and the fight for a soul had to begin anew. I dropped the receiver as if it had burned me. It clattered against the reception desk, the dial tone a shrill, mocking sound in the sudden, oppressive silence of the gallery. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. The tremor had subsided, but the air still felt thick, heavy with an unseen menace. The peaceful tranquility of the past few months shattered, replaced by a cold, insidious dread that was far worse than the original terror. because it was born of betrayal and a twisted continuation. Professor Finch, kind, brilliant, courageous Professor Finch. The man who had saved me, who had guided me through the darkest nightmare, was now the nightmare's unwilling host. The parasitic entity, the very thing we had fought so hard to banish, was inside him. My gaze flew to the Blackwood portrait. Its melancholic sorrow, which had felt like peace moments ago, now seemed to twist into a silent lament, a tragic foreshadowing. Blackwood had been a fool, an arrogant dabbler, but he had been trapped. Finch, however, had been a scholar, a protector, a beacon of hope. And now, a wave of nausea washed over me, cold and clammy. I stumbled back from the desk, my legs suddenly weak. This wasn't just a renewed threat, it was a personal devastation. Finch was more than just a colleague, he had become a mentor, a friend. The thought of that ancient, malevolent consciousness twisting his mind, consuming his soul, was unbearable. I had to go to Oakhaven, to Professor Finch. But what could I do? What weapons did I have against an entity that could possess the very man who understood its nature? My mind raced, frantically searching for answers, for a plan. I tried to remember every detail Professor Finch had told me about the entity, about possession, about unbinding. He had spoken of a vessel, of a permanent, vital link. And now the amulet was that link, the prison that had become a conduit. First, I had to confirm. Was it really him? Was he truly possessed? The tremor, the growl, it wasn't good. I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling as I called Professor Finch's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went straight to voicemail. His usual calm, academic greeting played, a stark contrast to the chilling memory of the call that had just ended. I tried again. Same result. The silence of the gallery pressed in on me. The twilight outside had deepened into full night, and the large windows now reflected only the dim interior, creating a labyrinth of shadows. I felt utterly alone, isolated with this terrifying knowledge. There was no time to lose. I had to get to Oakhaven. I snatched my car keys from my purse, not even bothering to lock up the gallery. Nothing inside mattered now. All that mattered was Professor Finch. The drive to Oakhaven Inn was a blur of frantic speed and white-knuckled terror. The autumn night was dark and cold, the winding country roads unfamiliar in my panicked state. Every shadow cast by the headlights seemed to twist into menacing shapes, every rustle of leaves sounding like a whisper. My mind replayed Professor Finch's choked gasp, the guttural growl that followed. He was fighting it, I knew he was, but for how long? I thought of Professor Finch's kindness, his unwavering belief in the face of the unknown. I remembered his meticulous notes, his careful rituals, his quiet courage. He wasn't just some academic, he was a man of integrity, driven by a desire to understand and protect. And now that very understanding had been turned against him. The irony was a bitter, cruel taste in my mouth. The entity now had access to Professor Finch's vast knowledge. Not just Blackwood's twisted, amateur dabbling, but Finch's deep, scholarly understanding of ancient methods, of binding and unbinding, of spiritual warfare. This made the entity infinitely more dangerous. It was no longer just a parasitic force. It was an intelligent parasitic force, armed with an encyclopedic knowledge of how to manipulate the very forces that could defeat it. What had Finch said about the binding box? It was a spiritual redirector, Croft's insurance policy. Had Croft known the entity could be redirected to another object, another vessel, it seemed like a desperate, twisted precaution. But to what end? To keep the entity away from him. And the amulet, Professor Finch had described it as an obscure protective charm. He had been wearing it since I brought him the binding box. That meant for months this ancient evil had been dormant, hidden, silently riding along with him, and now it was awake. I arrived at the Oakhaven Inn, the old building looking quaint and peaceful under the moonless sky. Too peaceful. The parking lot was empty save for Professor Finch's familiar sedan. My car screeched to a halt and I practically leapt out, my heart pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. The front door was unlocked. I slipped inside, the familiar warmth and scent of old wood and potpourri doing little to soothe my nerves. The reception area was deserted. "Professor Finch," I called out, my voice trembling. Only silence answered, a silence that felt heavier, more watchful than before. I knew his room was on the second floor. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles ached. Each step echoed ominously in the quiet inn. As I reached the landing, a faint, almost imperceptible hum reached my ears. It was familiar. The hum of raw, contained power, but now it felt amplified, more erratic. It was coming from Professor Finch's room. I approached his door cautiously, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible within. I pushed it open slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The scene that greeted me was a horrifying parody of the scholarly chaos I remembered. Books and papers were strewn everywhere, as usual, but now they were ripped, torn, scattered as if by a violent whirlwind. The salt circle around the space where the binding box usually sat was broken, smeared across the floor. The beeswax candles were overturned, their wicks extinguished, leaving the room illuminated only by a single flickering table lamp which cast long, dancing shadows. And Professor Finch. He was slumped in his armchair, his head thrown back, eyes wide and staring blankly at the ceiling. His spectacles were askew, and a thin trickle of blood ran from his nose, drying on his pale cheek. The silver amulet, the protective charm, gleamed ominously around his neck, nestled against his throat. My first thought was that he was dead. My heart seized in my chest, a cry catching in my throat. But then, a subtle movement. A tremor ran through his body, his head lolling to the side. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper escaped his lips, a garbled sound that was half a plea, half a guttural snarl. He was alive, but he wasn't himself. As I stared horrified at Professor Finch, I saw it, the same phenomenon I had witnessed in Blackwood's portrait. Beneath the familiar lines of his face, a faint, almost transparent second visage began to emerge. It was skeletal, predatory, its features twisting and shifting like smoke in a breeze. The entity, it was there, struggling for dominance, feeding on his soul. The hum in the room intensified, becoming a low thrum that vibrated through the floorboards up into my feet. The metallic scent, sharp and coppery, filled my nostrils. The air grew heavy, oppressive, threatening to suffocate me. "Professor Finch," I whispered, my voice barely audible, thick with terror. His head snapped towards me, his eyes, usually kind and intellectual, now burning with a cold, malevolent light that was utterly alien. His lips peeled back in a grotesque imitation of a smile, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too long. The whisper that escaped him was not his. "Welcome, Clara," the voice hissed, a chilling, multi-layered sound that was both familiar and utterly demonic. It was the same voice I had heard in the basement, but now it was deeper, richer, imbued with a terrible new power. "You have come home again." My blood ran cold, it remembered me, it knew me, and it was gleeful. Professor Finch's body began to convulse, a violent spasm that sent the armchair scraping across the floor. His head thrashed from side to side, and a genuine, agonized grunt escaped his lips, quickly subsumed by the entity's chilling laughter. It was a terrifying battle playing out within his very being. "What have you done to him?" I cried, my voice shaking. "Done?" The entity's voice rasped from Finch's mouth, tilting his head at an unnatural angle. "I have merely occupied a vacancy, a most convenient vacancy. Your foolish professor sought to contain me, to banish me. He merely redirected me. A clever trick for a mortal, but his pride made him complacent. He saw a charm where he should have seen a cage, and now the cage is mine, and so is he." It gestured with Finch's hand, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of immense, ancient power. Its gaze, through Finch's eyes, fixed on me, a predatory gleam. "And now I have his knowledge, his understanding of the bindings, the unbindings, the very fabric of your fragile reality. A most delightful acquisition. I am evolved." "Let him go," I demanded, finding a spark of courage amidst the terror. "You have no right." The entity, speaking through Finch, let out a dry, rattling chuckle. "Right? What is right to an entity such as I? I am ancient, Clara. I predate your petty morality. I am hunger. I am essence. And this vessel, this new skin, is quite delectable." It paused, its head tilting again. "And you are an interesting constant in this little drama, so persistent, so resonant." It pushed itself up from the armchair, Finch's limbs moving stiffly, awkwardly, like a marionette. The silver amulet pulsed with a faint, reddish light against his throat. "You still carry the scent of the artifacts, Clara, the lingering essence. You were a conduit for their removal, and now you are a beacon for my attention. Perhaps you are not just a visitor. Perhaps you are meant to be a permanent residence." It took a slow, deliberate step towards me, the floorboards groaning under its unsettling gait. Professor Finch's eyes, wide and unnervingly bright, stared into mine, but it was not Finch I saw. It was a cold, alien intelligence, studying me, assessing me. I backed away, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass candelabra on a nearby table. It was a futile gesture, I knew, but I needed something, anything, to feel less vulnerable. "Where are the artifacts?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, to buy time to understand. The entity chuckled again, a sound that grated on my nerves. "Secure, as your professor so meticulously ensured. He thought to hide them from me. A quaint notion, but they are merely anchors, Clara, physical tools. I am an idea, a hunger, and now I have a mind far more capable than that foolish Blackwood. I have access to everything your professor knew, his research, his notes, his understanding of the unbinding and the binding." It took another step closer. "And I remember you, Clara. I remember your touch upon the binding box. I remember your fear. It resonated with me. You were ripe for the plucking." "You won't have me," I retorted, clutching the candelabra tighter. "Oh, but I will, eventually. All things come to me in time, but for now I have a more immediate concern." It paused, its head cocked, as if listening to something far away or deep within. "This vessel it resists. The old man fights. A remarkable will, most amusing." A flicker of hope ignited within me. Finch was fighting. He was still in there. "He is strong," the entity acknowledged, as if reading my thoughts, a hint of annoyance in its tone. "But that merely makes the feeding more delicious, more prolonged." Its gaze fell on the overturned, shattered salt circle. He tried to use the containment against me, such a predictable response. He sealed away the artifacts, but did not anticipate that his own body could become the prison. Croft's final cunning twist. The binding box redirected me, but the amulet was designed not just as a charm, but as a secondary, last resort vessel. A failsafe for the cultists, perhaps. A way to contain it if it escaped Blackwood's painting before it could fully manifest. A place to store it, inert, until a new host could be found or a new binding ritual prepared. It paused, then continued, a triumphant gleam in its eyes, or until it could awaken itself within the unwary scholar. "You won't get away with this," I said, my voice firmer now. "We defeated you once, we'll do it again." The entity laughed, a long, drawn-out, chilling sound. "Defeated, you merely inconvenienced me. You severed my physical anchors, yes, you forced me into a smaller, more contained space, but I was never destroyed, and now I am free to move, I am mobile, and I have the knowledge of your grand plans for my destruction." It gestured around the wrecked room with Finch's hand. He was trying to figure out how to unbind himself, how to contain me. Foolish old man. He thought his scholarly tools could defeat an ancient hunger. It took another step, and I instinctively retreated towards the door, candelabra held ready. "Where are you going?" "To retrieve my anchors, of course," the entity hissed, its eyes burning. "Now that I have the knowledge to undo his petty locks, the wards he placed upon them, I need them, Clara, not to sustain me, but to amplify my reach, to gather others, to truly awaken my full potential in this world. And your professor, he hid them well, but not well enough. I know their locations now, and I know the specific unbinding chance for his wards." My blood ran cold. The artifacts, the mirrors, the flute, the binding box. If the entity possessing Professor Finch could retrieve them and undo their containment, it would be unstoppable. It would have the power to project its influence, to draw forth more entities, to truly spread its malevolence. "You can't," I cried. "They're warded. You can't reach them." "Oh, but I can," it said, a cruel smile twisting Finch's lips. His mind is a treasure trove of such information. He documented everything, every ward, every counterward, every incantation. Such a thorough scholar, so utterly predictable. He even had a backup plan in case I ever gained mobility. A secret location heavily warded in the event he was compromised. He was very proud of it, said it was unbreakable. The entity's eyes flashed with a predatory glee. "And now I know exactly where it is, and I know how to break it." It lunged. It wasn't a fast, athletic lunge, but a clumsy, almost lurching movement. Finch's body was not fully under its control, not yet. He fought back. I saw it in the tremor, in the slight hesitation, in the way his eyes seemed to flicker, momentarily regaining a spark of his own while before being extinguished again by the parasitic force. But it was enough. I reacted purely on instinct, swinging the heavy candelabra with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud against Finch's shoulder. A shriek of pure, unholy rage erupted from Finch's mouth, a sound that was not human. His body recoiled, stumbling back, momentarily thrown off balance. The silver amulet around his neck pulsed brighter, a furious red light. "Foolish girl," the entity shrieked, its voice distorted, full of pain and fury. "You dare to strike this vessel, you dare to impede my progress." I didn't wait. I spun around and fled, out the door, down the stairs, adrenaline coursing through me. I heard a scraping sound from the room, followed by a heavy thud as if Finch's body had hit something. He was still fighting, or the entity was simply too disoriented by the unexpected blow. I burst out of the inn, gasping for breath, the cold night air a shock to my lungs. I scrambled into my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely insert the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing, and sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. Where could I go? What could I do? The entity had Finch's knowledge. It knew the locations of the artifacts, the counterwards. It was going to retrieve them. And then it would be unstoppable. I had to warn someone, but who? Who would believe me? And how could I explain it? My professor has been possessed by an ancient parasitic entity, and it's going to steal magical artifacts to take over the world. I'd be locked up. There was only one person who understood, and he was currently a prisoner in his own mind. I drove aimlessly for a few minutes, my mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. Then a thought, cold and stark, pierced through the chaos. He knows where the artifacts are. He knows how to get to them, but where would he go first? The entity needed the artifacts to amplify its reach, to fully awaken its potential. It had specified the mirrors, the flute, the binding box. They were all contained, presumably in Professor Finch's secure, warded vault. But he had also spoken of a secret location, heavily warded, a backup plan in case he was compromised. If the entity truly had access to Finch's entire mind, it would know about this location. It would also know that this location likely contained more powerful, or at least more sensitive, items. Items Finch had deemed too dangerous to keep at Oakhaven. And then it hit me, the Blackwood Gallery, the very place we had started. Finch had expressed a deep respect for the gallery's history, its hidden depths. He had spent months studying Blackwood's methods, his failures, his precautions. It was logical that he might have secreted something vital, something truly dangerous within the gallery itself, knowing Blackwood's initial folly was contained there. He had alluded to Croft's notes about certain materials within the gallery having specific properties. The hidden chamber, the subterranean passage. No, we had sealed that off. The HVAC team had found nothing, just an empty chamber. But what if Finch, in his paranoia, had hidden something else within the gallery, something that was only activated or accessible with his specific knowledge? Or what if the entity's goal was not just to retrieve the artifacts, but to return to its original power source, to the very place where Blackwood had first summoned it, to complete the circle? The tremor, it hadn't just been a ripple of malice, it had felt like a pulse, a resonance, a connection. The gallery had always been connected to the entity. What if it was trying to return to its origin point, to the nexus of its power? I spun the car around, tires squealing again, the Blackwood Gallery. I had to get back there, not to warn, but to intercept. If the entity, through Finch, was going there, then I had to stop it, or at least buy enough time to figure out a new plan. The drive back was even more terrifying. The knowledge that my mentor, my friend, was now a puppet for an ancient evil, and that he was likely heading to the very place I had just fled, filled me with a cold dread. The gallery, which had been a sanctuary of peace moments ago, was now a potential battleground. I reached the gallery in record time, pulling up to the curb. The building loomed dark and silent under the streetlights. The front door, which I had left unlocked, was still ajar. A wave of sickening certainty washed over me. He was here. He was already inside. I parked hastily and slipped out of my car, my gaze scanning the street. No other vehicles, no signs of struggle, just the eerie stillness of the late night. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the main hall. The cleansing incense, the purified water, the rock salt and iron filings, all our efforts to create a spiritual barrier, now felt utterly meaningless. The air was heavy, thick with the same oppressive chill I had felt in Finch's room. The metallic scent was back, stronger than ever. The Blackwood portrait hung on the wall, its sorrowful face now seeming to watch me, its eyes deep pools of regret. But there was something else there now, too. A faint shimmer, a subtle distortion around its edges, as if the canvas itself was breathing, or as if the entity was once again trying to connect with it, to draw power from its original host. Professor Finch, I called out, my voice barely a whisper, echoing in the vast, dark hall. No answer, only the insidious hum, now radiating directly from the main hall, seemingly from the very walls. I pulled out my phone, turning on its flashlight. Its beam cut a shaky path through the gloom, illuminating the familiar surroundings. I moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. The main hall was undisturbed, no signs of Professor Finch. But then I saw it, a faint trail, almost invisible, glimmering on the polished floor. It was a fine, almost transparent dust, barely visible